Section 10 of His Family. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Carson. His Family by Ernest POOLE. Chapter 31. If there were any cloud upon his horizon, it was the thought of Laura. She had barely been to the house since Edith had come back to town. And at times, especially in the days when things had looked dark for Roger, he had caught himself reproaching this giddy-gaddy youngest child, so engrossed in her small menage that apparently she could not spare a thought for her widowed sister. Laura, on her return from abroad, had brought as a gift for Edith a morning gown from Paris, a most alluring creation, so much so, in fact, that Edith had felt it simply indecent, insulting, and had returned it to her sister with a stilted note of thanks. But Roger did not know of this. There were so many ways, he thought, in which Laura might have been nice to Edith. She had a gorgeous limousine in which she might so easily have come and taken her sister off on little trips uptown. But no, she kept her car to herself. And from her small apartment, where a maid whom she had brought from Rome dressed her several times each day, that limousine rushed her noiselessly forth, gay and wild as ever, immaculate and elegant, radiant and very rich. To what places did she go? What new friends was she making? What was Laura up to? He did not like her manner one evening when she came to the house. As he helped her off with her cloak, a sleek, supple leopard skin, which fitted her figure like a glove, he asked, "Where's Hal this evening?" And she answered lightly, "Oh, don't ask me what he does with himself." "You mean, I suppose," said Edith, with quiet disapproval, "that he is rushed to death this year with all this business from the war?" "Yes, it's business," Laura replied, as she deftly smoothed and patted her soft, abundant reddish hair. "And it's war, too," she added. "What do you mean?" her father asked. He knew what she meant, war with her husband. But before Laura could answer him, Edith cut in hastily, for two of her children were present. At dinner she turned the talk to the war, but even on this topic Laura's remarks were disturbing. She did not consider the war wholly bad. By no means, it had many good points. It was clearing away a lot of old rubbish, customs, superstitions, and institutions out of date. Musty old relics, she called them. She spoke as though repeating what someone else had told her. Laura, with her chicken's mind, could never have thought it all out by herself. When asked what she meant, she was smilingly vague, with a glance at Edith's youngsters. But she threw out hints about the church and even Christianity, as though it were falling to pieces. She spoke of a second Renaissance, a glorious pagan era coming. And then she exploded a little bomb by inquiring of Edith, "What do you think the girls over there are going to do for husbands, with half the marriageable men either killed or hopelessly damaged? They're not going to be nuns all their lives." Again her sister cut her off, and the rest of the brief evening was decidedly awkward. Yes, she was changing, growing fast, and Roger did not like it. Here she was spending money like water, absorbed in her pleasures, having no baby, apparently at loose ends with her husband, and through it all so cocksure of herself and her outrageous views about war, and smiling about them with such an air, and in her whole manner such a tone of amused superiority. She talked about a world for the strong, bits of gabble from Nietzsche, and that sort of rot. She spoke blithely of a Rome reborn, the wings of the eagles heard again. This part of it she had taken, no doubt, from her new Italian friend, her husband's shrapnel partner. Pshaw! What was Laura up to? But that was only one evening. It was not repeated. Another month went quickly by, and Roger had soon shaken it from him, for he had troubles enough at home. One daughter at a time, he had thought. And as the dark clouds close above him had cleared, the other cloud too had drifted away, until it was small, just on the horizon, far away from Roger's house. What was Laura up to? He barely ever thought of that now. But one night when he came home, Edith, who sat in the living room reading aloud to her smaller boys, gave him a significant look which warned him something had happened. And turning to take off his overcoat, in the hall he almost stumbled upon a pile of hand luggage, 2 smart patent leather bags, a hat trunk, and a sable cloak. "Hello," he exclaimed. "What's this? Who's here?" "Laura," Edith answered. "She's up in Deborah's room, I think. They've been up there for over an hour." Roger looked indignantly in at his daughter. "What has happened?" he asked. "I'm afraid I can't tell you," Edith replied. "They didn't seem to need me. They made it rather plain, in fact. Another quarrel, I presume." She came into the house like a whirlwind, asked at once for Deborah, and flew up to Deborah's room. "Pshaw!" Roger heavily mounted the stairs. He at least did not feel like flying. A whirlwind, hey? A nice evening ahead. Meanwhile, in her room upstairs, Deborah sat motionless, sternly holding her feelings down, while in a tone now kindly but more often full of a sharp dismay, she threw out question after question to Laura, who was walking the floor in a quick, feverish sort of way, with gestures half hysterical, her voice bursting with emotions of mingled fright and rage. "No, this time it's divorce," she declared, at the end of her first outburst, in which she had told in fragments of her husband's double life. "I've stood it long enough. I'm through." "You mean you don't care for him?" Deborah said. She was fighting for time to think it out. "You want a divorce. Very well, Laura dear. But how do you think you're going to get it? The laws are very strict in this state. They allow but one cause. Have you any proofs?" "No, I haven't. But I don't need any proofs. He wants it as badly as I do. Wait, I'll give you his very words." Laura's face grew white with fury. "It's entirely up to you, sweetie," the beast. "You can have any kind of divorce you like. You can let me bring suit on the quiet, or you can try to fight me in court. Climb up into the witness chair in front of the reporters and tell them all about yourself." "Your husband is to bring suit against you?" Deborah's voice was loud and harsh. "For God's sake, Laura, what do you mean?" "Mean? I mean that he has proofs. He has used a detective, the mean little cur, and he's treating me like the dirt under his feet. Just as though it were one thing for a man and another, quite, for a woman. He even had the nerve to be mad, to get on a high horse, call me names, turn me out on the street." Deborah winced as though from a blow. "Oh, it was funny. Laura was almost sobbing now. "Stop this minute," Deborah said. "You say that you've been doing what he has?" she demanded. "Why shouldn't I? What do you know about it? Are you going to turn against me too?" "I am, pretty nearly." "Oh, good God!" Laura tossed up her hands and went on with her walking. "Quiet. Please try to be clear and explain." "Explain? To you? How can I? You don't understand. You know nothing about it. All you know about is schools. You're simply a nun when it comes to this. I see it now. I didn't before. I thought you a modern woman with your mind open to new ideas. But it isn't, it seems, when it comes to a pinch. It's shut as tight as Edith's is." "Yes, tight. Thank you very much." "Then for the love of heaven, will you kindly leave me alone? I'll have to talk with father." "You will not have a talk with father." "I most certainly will, and he'll understand. He's a man at least, and he led a man's life before he was married." "Laura!" "You can't see it in him, but I can." "You'll say not a word to him, not one word." He has had enough this year as it is." "Has he? Then I'm sorry. If you were any help to me, instead of acting like a nun—" "Will you please stop talking like a fool?" "I'm not. I'm speaking the truth, and you know it. You know no more about love like mine than a man of the Middle Ages. You needn't tell me about Allan Baird. You think you're in love with him, don't you? Well then, I'll tell you that you're not. Your love is the kind that can wait for years because it's cold. It's cold. It's cold. It's all in your mind and your reason. And so I say you're no help to me now. Here, look at yourself in the glass over there. You're just plain angry. Frightened." "Yes, I am. I'm frightened." While she strove to think clearly, to form some plan, she let her young sister talk rapidly on. "I know you are, and you can't be fair. You're like nearly all American women. Married or single, young or old, you're all of you scared to death about sex, just as your Puritan mothers were. And you leave it alone. You keep it down. You never give it a chance. You're afraid. But I'm not afraid, and I'm living my life. And let me tell you, I'm not alone. There are hundreds and thousands doing the same, right here in New York City tonight. It's been so abroad for years and years. In Rome and Berlin, in Paris and London, and now, thank God, it has come over here. If our husbands can do it, why can't we? And we are. We're starting. It's come with the war. You think war is hell and nothing else, don't you? But you're wrong. It's not only killing men, it's killing a lot of hypocrisies too. It's giving a jolt to marriage. You'll see what the women will do soon enough, when there aren't enough men any longer." "Suppose you stop this tirade and tell me exactly what you've done," Deborah interrupted. A simple course of action had just flashed into her mind. "All right, I will. I'm not ashamed. I've given you this tirade to show you exactly how I feel. That it's not any question of sin or guilt or any musty old rubbish like that. I know I'm right. I know just what I'm doing. Who's the man? That Italian? Yes. Where is he? Right here in New York. Does he mean to stand by you? Of course he does. Will he marry you, Laura? Yes, he will, the minute I'm free from my beast of a husband. And your husband will keep his suit quiet, you said? If you agree not to fight him? Yes. Deborah rose abruptly. "Then will you stay right here tonight and leave this matter to me?" she asked. "What do you mean to do?" "See your husband." "What for? When?" "Tonight, if I can. I want to be sure." Laura looked for the moment nonplussed. "And what of my wishes?" she inquired. "Your wishes," said Deborah steadily. "You want a divorce, don't you? So do I. And you want it quiet. And so do I. I want it so hard that I want to make sure." Deborah's tone was kinder now, and she came over close to her sister. "Look here, Laura. If I've been hard, forgive me, please. And let me help. I'm not so narrow as you think. I've been through a good deal of this before. Downtown, I mean, with girls in my school. They come to me, we have long talks. Maybe I am a nun, as you say. But I'm one with a confessional. Not for sins," she added, as Laura looked up angrily. "Sins don't interest me very much. But troubles do. And heaven knows that marriage is one," she said with a curious bitterness. "And when it has failed and there's no love left, as in your case, I'm for divorce. Only," her wide sensitive lips quivered just a little, "I'm sorry it had to come like this. But I love you, dear, and I want to help. I want to see you safely through. And while I'm doing it, if we can, I want to keep Dad out of it, at least until it's settled." She paused a moment. "So, if you agree, I'll go to your husband. I want to be sure, absolutely, just what we can count on. And until I come back, stay here in my room. You don't want to talk to father and Edith." "Most certainly not," Laura muttered. "Good. Then stay here until I return. I'll send you up some supper." "I don't want any, thank you." Laura went and threw herself on the bed while her sister finished dressing. "It's decent of you, Deborah." Her voice was muffled and relaxed. "I wasn't fair," she added. "I'm sorry for some of the things I said. "About me and marriage?" Deborah looked at herself in the glass in a peculiar searching way. A slight spasm crossed her features. "I'm not sure but that you were right. At times I feel far from certain," she said. Laura lifted her head from the pillow, watched her sister a moment, dropped back. "Don't let this affect you, Deborah." "Oh, don't worry, dearie." And Deborah moved toward the door. "My affair is just mine, you see, and this won't make any difference." But in her heart she knew it would. What an utter loathing she had to night for all that people meant by sex. Suddenly she was quivering, her limbs and her whole body hot. "You say I'm cold," she was thinking. "Cold toward Allan, calm and cool, nothing but mind and reason. You say it means little to me, all that. But if I had had trouble with Allan, would I have come running home to talk? Wouldn't I have hugged it tight? And isn't that love? What do you know of me and the life I've led? Do you know how it feels to want to work, to be something yourself, without any man? And can't that be a passion? Have you had to live with Edith here and see what motherhood can be, what it can do to a woman? And now you come with another side, just as narrow as hers, devouring everything else in sight. And because I'm a little afraid of that, for myself and all I want to do, you say I don't know what love is. But I do. And my love's worth more than yours. It's deeper, richer, it will last. Then why do I loathe it all tonight? But I don't. I don't loathe your side. But yours is the very heart of it. All right, then what am I going to do?" She was going slowly down the stairs. She stopped for a moment, frowning. Chapter 32. On the floor below she met her father, who was coming out of his room. He looked at her keenly. "What's the trouble?" "Laura's here," she answered. "Trouble again with her husband. Better leave her alone for the present. She's going to stay in my room for a while." "Very well," her father grunted, and they went down to dinner. There Deborah was silent, and Edith did most of the talking. Edith, quite aware of the fact that Laura and all Laura's ways were in disgrace for the moment, and that she and her ways with her children, shown by comparison, was bright and sweet and tactful. Roger glanced at her more than once, with approval and with gratitude for the effect she was making to smooth over the situation. Deborah rose before they had finished. "Where are you off to?" Roger asked. "Oh, there's something I have to attend to." "School again this evening, dear?" inquired Edith cheerfully, but her sister was already out of the room. She looked at her father with quiet concern. "I'm sorry she has to be out tonight of all nights," she murmured. "Humph!" ejaculated her father. This eternal school business of Deborah's was beginning to get on his nerves. Yes, just a little on his nerves. Why couldn't she give up one evening, just one, and get Laura out of this snarl she was in? He heard her on the telephone, and presently she came back to them. "Oh, Edith," she said casually, "don't send any supper up to Laura. She says she doesn't want any tonight. And ask Hannah to put a cot in my room, will you?" "Yes, dear, I'll attend to it. Thanks." And again she left them. In silence, when the front door closed, Edith looked at her father. This must be rather serious, Roger thought excitedly. So Laura was to stay all night, while Deborah gallivanted off to those infernal schools of hers. He had little joy in his paper that night. The news of the world had such a trick of suddenly receding 1,000,000 miles away from a man the minute he was in trouble. And Roger was in trouble. With each slow tick of the clock in the hall, he grew more certain and more disturbed. An hour passed. The clock struck 9. With a snort, he tossed his paper aside. "Well, Edith," he said glumly, "how about some chess this evening?" In answer, she gave him a quick smile of understanding and sympathy. "All right, father dear." And she fetched the board. But they had played only a short time when Deborah's latchkey was heard in the door. Roger gave an angry hitch to his chair. Soon she appeared in the doorway. "May I talk to you, Father?" she asked. "I suppose so," Roger scowled. "You'll excuse us, Edith?" she added. "Oh, assuredly, dear." And Edith rose, looking very much hurt. "Of course, if I'm not needed." At this her father scowled again. Why couldn't Deborah show her sister a little consideration? "What is it?" he demanded. "Suppose we go into the study," she said. He followed her there and shut the door. "Well?" he asked from his big leather chair. Deborah had remained standing. "I've got some bad news," she began. "What is it?" he snapped. "School burnt down?" Savagely he bit off a cigar. "I've just had a talk with Harold," she told him. He shot a glance of surprise and dismay. "Have, hey? What's it all about?" "It's about a divorce," she answered. The lighted match dropped from Roger's hand. He snatched it up before it was out and lit his cigar, and puffing smoke in a vigilant way, again he eyed his daughter. "I've done what I could," she said painfully, "but they seem to have made up their minds." "Then they'll unmake them," he replied, and he leaned forward heavily. "They'll unmake 'em," he repeated in a thick, unnatural tone. "I'm not a-goin' to hear to it." In a curious manner his voice had changed. It sounded like that of a man in the mountains, where he had been born and raised. This thought flashed into Deborah's mind, and her wide resolute mouth set hard. It would be very difficult. "I'm afraid this won't do, Father dear, whether you give your consent or not." "Won't it? You wait and see if it won't." Deborah came close to him. "Suppose you wait till you understand," she admonished sternly. "All right, I'm waiting," he replied. She felt herself trembling deep inside. She did not want him to understand, any more than she must to induce him to keep out of this affair. "To begin with," she said steadily, "you will soon see yourself, I think, that they fairly loathe the sight of each other, that there is no real marriage left." "That's fiddlesticks," snapped Roger. "Just modern talk and new ideas. Ideas you're to blame for. Yes, you are. You put 'em into her head. You and your gabble about women's rights." He was angry now. He was glad he was angry. He'd just begun. "If you want me to leave her alone," his daughter cut in sharply, "just say so." "I'll leave it all to you." And she saw him flinch a little. "What would be your idea?" she asked. "My idea?" "She's to go straight home and make up with him." She hesitated. Then she said, "Suppose there's another woman?" "Then he's a beast," growled Roger. "And yet you want her to live with him?" He scowled. He felt baffled, his mind in a whirl, and a wave of exasperation suddenly swept over him. "Well, why shouldn't she?" he cried. "Other wives have done it. Millions. Made a devilish good success of it, too. Made new men of their husbands. Let her show him she's ready to forgive. That's only Christian, ain't it? Hard? Of course it's hard on her. But can you tell me one hard thing she's ever had to do in her life? Hasn't it been pleasure? Pleasure from the word go? Can't she stand something hard? Don't we all of us have to? I do, God knows, with all of you." And he puffed his cigar in a fury. His daughter smiled. She saw her chance. "Father," she said in a low, clear voice, "you've had so many troubles. Why not leave this one to me? You can't help. No matter how hard you try, you'll only make it worse and worse. And you've been through so much this year. You've earned the right to be quiet. And that's what they want, both of them. They both want it quiet, without any scandal." Her father glared, for he knew about scandal. He handled it in his office each day. "Let me manage this, please," she said, and her offer tempted him. He struggled for a moment. "No, I won't," he burst out in reply. "I want quiet right enough, but not at the price of her peace with her God." This sounded foolish. He felt that it did, and he flushed and grew the angrier. "No, I won't," he said stubbornly. "She'll go back to him if I take her myself. And what's more," he added, rising, "she's to go straight back to-night." "She is not going back to-night, my dear." And Deborah caught her father's arm. "Sit down, please." "I've heard enough." "I'm afraid you haven't," she replied. "Very well." His smile was caustic. "Give me some more of it," he said. "Her husband won't have her," said Deborah bluntly. "He told me so himself to-night." "Did he, hey? Then I'll talk to him." "He thinks," she went on in a desperate tone, "that Laura has been leading her own little life, as he put it to me. Eh? He is bringing suit himself." "Oh, he is?" cried Roger hoarsely. "Then I will talk to this young man." But she put out a restraining hand. "Father, don't try to fight this suit." "You watch me," he snarled. Tears showed in his eyes. "Think, oh please, think what you're doing. Have you ever seen a divorce court here in New York? Do you know what it's like, what it can be like?" Yes, Roger panted. He did know, and the picture came vividly into his mind. A mass of eager devouring eyes fixed on a girl in a witness chair. "Tomorrow I see a lawyer," he said. "No, you won't do that, my dear," Deborah told him sadly. "Laura's husband has got proofs." Her father looked up slowly and glared into his daughter's face. "I've seen them myself," she added, "and Laura has admitted it, too." Still for a moment he stared at her. Then slowly he settled back in his chair. His eyes dropped in their sockets, and very carefully, with a hand which was trembling visibly, he lifted his cigar to his lips. It had gone nearly out, but he drew on it hard until it began to glow again. "Well," he asked simply, "what shall we do?" Sharply Deborah turned away, to be quiet, to be matter-of-fact, to act as though nothing had happened at all. She knew this was what he wanted now, what he was silently begging her to be for his sake, for the family's sake. For he had been raised in New England, and so when she turned back to him, her voice was flat and commonplace. "Keep her here," he said. "Let him do what he likes. There'll be nothing noisy, he promised me that. But keep her here till it's over." Roger smoked for a moment and said, "There's Edith and her children." "The children needn't know anything, and Edith only part of it." "The less the better," he grunted. "Of course." She looked at him anxiously. This tractable mood of his might not last. "Why not go up and see her now and get it over, so you can sleep?" Over Roger's set heavy visage flitted a smile of grim relish at that. Sleep. Deborah was funny. Resolutely he rose from his chair. "You'll be careful, of course," she admonished him, and he nodded in reply. At the door he turned back. "Where's the other chap?" "I don't know," she answered. "Surely you don't want to see him?" Her father snorted his contempt. "See him? No, nor she neither. She's not to see him. Understand? I wouldn't tell her that to-night." "Look here," Roger eyed his daughter a moment. "You've done well, I've no complaint. But don't try to manage everything." He went out and slowly climbed the stairs. Outside the bedroom door he paused. When had he stood like this before? In a moment he remembered. One evening, some 2 years ago, the night before Laura's wedding, when they had had that other talk. And so it had come to this, had it? Well, there was no use making a scene. Again, with a sigh of weariness, Laura's father knocked at her door. "Come in, Deborah," she said. "It isn't Deborah, it's I." There was a little silence. "Very well, father, come in, please." Her voice sounded tired and lifeless. He opened the door and found the room dark. "I'm over on the bed," she said. "I've had a headache this evening." He came over to the bedside, and he could just see her there, a long shadow under the white. She had not taken off her clothes. He stood a moment helplessly. "Please don't you talk to me," his daughter fiercely whispered. "I can't stand any more tonight." "I won't," he answered. "It's too late." Again there was a pause. "What time is it?" she asked him. But he did not answer. "Well, Laura," he said presently, "your sister has told me everything. She has seen your husband. It's all arranged. And you're to stay here till it's over. You want to stay here, don't you?" "Yes." "Then it's settled," he went on. "There's only one thing, the other man. I don't know who he is, and I don't want to know. And I don't want you to know him again. You're not to see him. Understand?" For a moment Laura was silent. "I'm going to marry him, father," she said. And standing in the darkened room, Roger stiffened sharply. "Well," he answered after a pause, "that's your affair. You're no longer a child. I wish you were," he added. Suddenly in the darkness Laura's hand came out clutching for his, but he had already turned to the door. "Good night," he said, and left her. In the hallway below he met Deborah, and to her questioning look he replied, "All right, I guess. Now I'm going to bed." He went into his room and closed the door. As soon as Roger was alone, he knew this was the hardest part. To be here by himself in this intimate room, with this worn blue rug, these pictures and this old mahogany bed. For he had promised Judith, his wife, to keep close to the children. What would she think of him if she knew? Judith had been a broad-minded woman, sensible, big-hearted, but she never would have stood for this. Once, he recollected, she had helped a girl-friend to divorce her husband, a drunkard who ran after chorus girls. But that had been quite different. There the wife had been innocent and had done it for her children. Laura was guilty. She hadn't a child. She was already planning to marry again. And then what, he asked himself. From bad to worse, very likely. A woman can't stop when she started downhill. His eye was caught by the picture directly before him on the wall, the one his wife had given him. Two herdsmen with their cattle high up on a shoulder of a sweeping mountainside, tiny blue figures against the dawn. It had been like a symbol of their lives, always beginning clean, glorious days. What was Laura beginning? "Well," he demanded angrily, as he began to jerk off his clothes, "what can I do about it? Try to keep her from remarrying, hey? And suppose I succeeded? How long would it last? She wouldn't stay here and I couldn't keep her. She'll be independent now. Her looks will be her bank account. There'd be some other chap in no time, and he might not even marry her." He tugged ferociously at his boots. "No, let well enough alone." He finished undressing, opened the window, turned out the gas and got into bed. Wearily he closed his eyes. But after a time he opened them and stared long through the windows up at the beetling cliff of a building close by, with its tier upon tier of lighted apartments, a huge garish hive of homes. Yes, the town was crowding down on him tonight, on his house and on his family. He realized it had never stopped, and that his 3 grown children, each one of them a part of himself, had been struggling with it all the time. Laura, wasn't she part of himself? Hadn't he too had his little fling back in his early 20s? You will live on in your children's lives. She was a part of him gone wild. She gave it free rein, took chances. God, what a chance she had taken this time. The picture of that court he had seen, with the girl in the witness chair and those many rows of eyes avidly fixed upon her, came back to his mind so vividly they seemed for a moment right here in the room, these eyes of the town boring into his house. Angrily he shut out the scene. And alone in the darkness, Roger said to his daughter all the ugly, furious things he had not said to her upstairs, until at last he was weary of it. "Why am I working myself all up? I've got to take this. It's my medicine." Chapter 33. But as he watched Laura in the house, Roger's first emotions were complicated more and more by a feeling of bewilderment. At dinner the next evening, he noticed with astonishment that she appeared like her natural self. She's acting, he decided. But this explanation he soon dismissed. No, it was something deeper. She was actually unashamed, unafraid. That first display of feelings, the night of her arrival, had been only the scare of an hour. Within a few days she was back on her feet. And her cure for her trouble, if trouble she felt, was not less but more pleasure, as always. She went out nearly every evening now, and when she had spent what money she had, she sold a part of her jewelry to the little old Galician Jew in the shop around the corner. Yes, she was her natural self, and she was as before to her father. Her attitude said plainly, "It isn't fair to you, poor dear, to expect you to fully understand how right I am in this affair, and considering your point of view, you're acting very nicely." Often, as she talked to him, a note of good-humored forgiveness crept into his daughter's voice, and looking at her grimly out the corner of his eye, he saw that she looked down on him, far, far down from heights above. "Yes," he thought, "this is modern." Then he grew angry all at once. "No," he added, "this is wrong. You can't fool me, young woman. You know it as well as I do myself. You're not going to carry this off with an air. Not with your father. No, by George." And he would grow abrupt and stern. But days would pass, and in spite of himself into their talks would creep a natural friendly tone. Again he found himself friends with her, friends as though nothing whatever had happened. Could it be that a woman who had so sinned could go right on? Here was Laura, serenely unconscious of guilt, and smiling into her future, dreaming still of happiness, quite plainly sure of it, in fact. With a curious dismayed relief, Roger would scowl at this daughter of his, a radiant enigma in his quiet, sober house. But Edith was not at all perplexed. When she learned from Deborah that there was soon to be a divorce, she came at once to her father. Her face was like a thundercloud. "A nice example for my children," she indignantly exclaimed. "I'm sorry, my dear, but what can I do?" "You can make her go back to her husband, can't you?" "No, I can't," he flatly replied. "Then I'd better try it myself." "You'll do no such thing," he retorted. "I've gone clear to the bottom of this, and I say you're to leave her alone." "Very well," she answered, and she did leave her sister alone, so severely that Laura soon avoided being home for lunch or dinner. She had taken the room which George had occupied ever since John had been turned out, and there she breakfasted, late in bed, until Edith put a stop to it. They barely spoke to each other now. Laura still smiled defiance. Days passed. Christmas came at last, and despite Edith's glum resolution to make it a happy time for the children, the happiness soon petered out. After the tree in the morning, the day hung heavy on the house. Roger buried himself in his study. Laura had motored off into the country with a gay party of her friends. Or was this just a ruse, he wondered, and was she spending the day with her lover? Well, what if she was? Could he lock her in? About twilight he thought he heard her return, and later from his bedroom he heard her voice and Edith's. Both voices sounded angry, but he would not interfere. At the Christmas dinner that evening Laura did not put in an appearance, but Edith sat stiff and silent there. And despite the obvious efforts which Deborah and Allan made to be genial with the children, the very air in the room was charged with the feeling of trouble close ahead. Again Roger retreated into his den, and presently Laura came to him. "Good night, I'm going out," she said, and she pressed her cheek lightly to his own. "What a dear you've been to me, Dad," she murmured, and then she was gone. A few minutes later Edith came in. She held a small note in her hand, which Roger saw was addressed to himself. "Well, father, I learned this afternoon what you've been keeping from me," she said. Roger gave her a steady look. "You did, eh? Laura told you?" "Yes, she did," his daughter exclaimed. "And I can't help wondering, father, why did she tell you? Have you been at her again today?" "Again? Not at all," she answered. "I've done as you asked me, let her alone. But today, Mother's Day, I got thinking of her." "Leave your mother out of it, please. What did you say to Laura?" "I tried to make her go back, of course." "And she told you?" "He wouldn't have her. And then in a perfect tantrum she went on to tell me why." Edith's eyes were cold with disgust. "And I'm wondering why you let her stay here, in the same house with my children." Roger reached out his hand. "Give me that note," he commanded. He read it quickly and handed it back. The note was from Laura, a hasty goodbye. "Edith will explain," she wrote, "and you will see I cannot stay any longer. It is simply too impossible. I'm going to the man I love, and in a few days we shall sail for Naples. I know you will not interfere. It will make the divorce even simpler and everything easier all around. Please don't worry about me. We shall soon be married over there. You have been so dear and sensible, and I do so love you for it." Then came her name scrawled hastily. "And at the bottom of the page, I have paid every bill I can think of." Edith read it in silence, her color slowly mounting. "All right," said her father. "Your children are safe." She gave him a quick, angry look, burst into tears and ran out of the room. Roger sat without moving, his heavy face impassive. And so he remained for a long time. Well, Laura was gone, no mistake about that, and this time she was gone for good. She was going to live in Rome. Try to stop her? No. What good would it do? Wings of the Eagles, Rome reborn. That was it, she had hit it, struck the keynote of this new age. Rome reborn, all clean, old-fashioned Christian living, swept away by millions of men at each other's throats like so many wolves. And at last, quite openly to himself, Roger admitted that he felt old and beaten, out of date. Moments passed, and hours. He took little note of time. Nor did he see on the mantel the dark visage of the thinker, there, resting on the huge clenched fist and brooding down upon him. Lower, imperceptibly, he sank into his leather chair. Quiet had returned to his house. End of section 10. Recording by James Carson. Section 11 of His Family by Ernest POOLE. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Carson. His Family by Ernest POOLE. Chapter 34. But the quiet was dark to Roger now. Each night he spent in his study alone, for instinctively he felt the need of being by himself for a while, of keeping away from his children, out of whose lives he divined that other events would soon come forth to use up the last of the strength that was in him. And Roger grew angry with the world. Why couldn't it leave a man alone? An old man in a silent house, alive for him with memories. Repeatedly in such hours his mind would go groping backward into the years behind him. What a long and winding road, half buried in the jungle, dim, almost impenetrable, made up of millions of small events, small worries, plans, and dazzling dreams, with which his days had all been filled. But the more he recalled, the more certain he grew that he was right. Life had never been like this. The world had never come smashing into his house, his very family, with its dirty, teeming tenements, its schools, its prisons, electric chairs, its feverish rush for money, its luxuries, its scandals. These things had existed in the world, but remote and never real, mere things which he had read about. War? Did he not remember wars that had come and gone in Europe? But they hadn't come into his home like this, first making him poor when he needed money for Edith and her children, then plunging Deborah into a struggle that might very probably ruin her life, and now taking Laura and filling her mind with thoughts of pagan living. Why was every man, woman and child these days bound up in the whole life of the world? What would come of it all? A new day out of this deafening night? Maybe so, but for him it would come too late. What have I left to live for? One night with a sigh he went to his desk, lit a cigar, and laid his hand upon a pile of letters which had been mounting steadily. It was made up of Laura's bills, the ones she had not remembered. Send them after her to Rome for that Italian fellow to pay? No, it could not be thought of. Roger turned to his dwindling bank account. He was not yet making money, he was still losing a little each week, but he would not cut expenses. To the few who were left in his employ, to be turned away would mean dire need, and angrily he determined that they should not starve to pay Laura's bills. The world for the strong, hey? Not in my office. In Rome or Berlin or Vienna, all right, but not over here. Grimly, when he had made out the checks, Roger eyed his balance. By spring he would be penniless. And he had no one to turn to now, no rich young son-in-law who could aid. He set himself doggedly to the task of forcing up his business, and meanwhile in the evenings he tried with Edith to get back upon their former footing. To do this was not easy at first, for his bitterness still rankled deep. When you were in trouble I took you in, but when she was in trouble you turned her out, as you turned out John before her. In the room again vacated, young George had been reinstalled. One night Edith found her father there, looking in through the open doorway, and the look on his massive face was hard. "Better have the room disinfected again," he muttered when he saw her. He turned and went slowly down the stairs, and she was late for dinner that night. But Edith had her children, and as he watched her night by night, hearing their lessons patiently, reading them fairy stories and holding them smilingly in her arms, the old appeal of her motherhood regained its hold upon him. One evening when the clock struck 9, putting down his paper, he suggested gruffly, "Well, daughter, how about some chess?" Edith flushed a little. "Why, yes, dear, I'd be glad to." She rose and went to get the board. So the games were resumed, and part at least of their old affection came to life. But only a part, it could never be quite the same again. And though he saw little of Deborah, slowly, almost unawares to them both, she assumed the old place she had had in his home, as the one who had been right there in the house through all the years since her mother had died, the one who had helped and never asked help, keeping her own troubles to herself. He fell back into his habit of going before dinner to his daughter's bedroom door to ask whether she would be home that night. At one such time, getting no response, and thinking Deborah was not there, he opened the door part way to make sure. And he saw her at her dresser, staring at herself in the glass, rigid as though in a trance. Later in the dining room he heard her step upon the stairs. She came in quietly and sat down. And as soon as dinner was over, she said her good nights and left the house. But when she came home at midnight, he was waiting up for her. He had foraged in the kitchen, and on his study table he had set out some supper. While she sat there eating, her father watched her from his chair. "Things going badly in school?" he inquired. "Yes," she replied. There was silence. "What's wrong?" Tonight we had a line of mothers reaching out into the street. They had come for food and coal, but we had to send most of them home empty-handed. Some of them cried, and one of them fainted. She's to have a baby soon. "Can't you get any money uptown?" he asked. "I have," she answered grimly. "I've been a beggar, heaven knows, on every friend I can think of. And I've kept a press agent hard at work trying to make the public see that Belgium is right here in New York." She stopped and went on with her supper. "But it's a bad time for work like mine," she continued presently. "If we're to keep it going, we must above all keep it cheap. That's the keynote these days. Keep everything cheap, at any cost, so that men can expensively kill one another." Her voice had a bitter ring to it. "You try to talk peace and they bowl you over with facts on the need of preparedness for the defense of your country. And that doesn't appeal to me very much. I want a bigger preparedness for the defense of the whole world, for democracy and human rights, no matter who the people are. I'd like to train every child to that." "What do you mean?" her father asked. "To teach him what his life can be," she replied in a hard, quivering tone. "A fight? Oh, yes, so long as he lives, and even with guns, if it must be so. But a fight for all the people on earth, and a world so full of happy lives that men will think hard before ever again letting themselves be led by the nose into war and death for a place in the sun." She rose from a chair with a weary smile. "Here I am making a speech again. I've made so many lately, it's become a habit. I'm tired out, Dad. I'm going to bed." Her father looked at her anxiously. "You're seeing things out of proportion," he said. "You've worked so hard, you're getting stale. You ought to get out of it for a while." "I can't," she answered sharply. "You don't know. You don't even guess how it takes every hour. All the demands. Where's Allan these days?" "Working," was her harsh reply. "Trying to keep his hospital going with half its staff. The woman who was backing him is giving her money to Belgium instead." "Do you see much of him?" "Every day." "Let's drop it, shall we?" "All right, my dear." And they said good night. In the meantime, in the house, Edith had tried to scrimp and save, but it was very difficult. Her children had so many needs, they were all growing up so fast. Each month brought fresh demands on her purse, and the fund from the sale of her belongings had been used up long ago. Her sole resource was the modest allowance her father gave her for running the house, and she had not asked him for more. She had put off trouble from month to month. But one evening early in March, when he gave her the regular monthly check, she said hesitatingly, "I'm very sorry, Father dear, but I'm afraid we'll need more money this month." He glanced up from his paper. "What's the matter?" She gave him a forced little smile, and her father noticed the gray in her hair. "Oh, nothing in particular. Goodness knows I've tried to keep down expenses, but well, we're a pretty large household, you know." "Yes," said Roger kindly, "I know." "Are the month's bills in?" "Yes." "Let me see them." She brought him the bills, and he looked relieved. "Not so many," he ventured. "No, but they're large." "Why, look here, Edith," he said abruptly. "These are bills for 2 months, some for 3, even 4. I know, that's just the trouble. I couldn't meet them at the time." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Laura was here, and I didn't want to bother you. You had enough on your mind as it was. I've done the best I could, Father dear. I've sold everything, you know. But I've about come to the end of my rope." And her manner said clearly, "I've done my part. I'm only a woman. I'll have to leave the rest to you." I see." And Roger knitted his heavy brows. "I presume I can get it somehow." This would play the very devil with things. "Father," Edith's voice was low, "why don't you let Deborah help you? She's done very little, it seems to me, compared to the size of her salary." "She can't do any more than she's doing now," was his decisive answer. Edith looked at him, her color high. She hesitated, then burst out. "I saw her checkbook the other day. She had left it on the table. She's spending thousands every month." "That's not her own money," Roger said. "No, it's money she gets for her fads, her work for those tenement children. She can get money enough for them." He flung out his hand. "Leave her out of this, please." "Very well, Father, just as you say." And she sat there hurt and silent, while again he looked slowly through the bills. He jotted down figures and added them up. They came to a bit over $900. Soon Deborah's key was heard in the door, and Roger scowled the deeper. She came into the room, but he did not look up. He heard her voice. "What's the matter, Edith?" "Bills for the house." "Oh," and Deborah came to her father. "May I see what's the trouble, dear?" "I'd rather you wouldn't. It's nothing," he growled. He wanted her to keep out of this. "Why shouldn't she see?" Edith tartly inquired. "Deborah is living here, and before I came she ran the house. In her place I should certainly want to know." Deborah was already glancing rapidly over the bills. "Why, Edith," she exclaimed, "most of these bills go back for months. Why didn't you pay them when they were due?" "Simply because I hadn't the money." "You've had the regular monthly amount. That didn't last long. Why didn't you tell us?" "Laura was here." Deborah gave a shrug of impatience, and Roger saw how tired she was, her nerves on edge from her long day. "Never mind about it now," he put in. "What a pity," Deborah muttered. "If we had been told, we could have cut down." "I don't agree with you," Edith rejoined. "I have already done that myself. I've done nothing else." "Have the servants been paid?" her sister asked. "No, they haven't." "Since when?" "3 months." Roger got up and walked the room. Deborah tried to speak quietly. "I can't quite see where the money has gone." "Can't you? Then look at my checkbook." And Edith produced it with a glare. Her sister turned over a few of the stubs. "What's this item?" "Where?" "Here, $122. "The dentist," Edith answered. "Not extravagant. It is for 5 children." "I see," said Deborah. "And this?" "Bedding," was Edith's sharp response. "A mattress and more blankets. I found there weren't half enough in the house." "You burned John's, didn't you?" "Naturally." All at once both grew ashamed. "Let's be sensible," Deborah said. "We must do something, Edith, and we can't till we're certain where we stand." "Very well." They went on more calmly and took up the items one by one. Deborah finished and was silent. "Well, Father, what's to be done?" she asked. "I don't know," he said shortly. "Somehow or other," Deborah said, "we've got to cut our expenses down." "I'm afraid that's impossible," Edith rejoined. "I've already cut as much as I can." "So did I in my school," said her sister. "And when I thought I had reached the end, I called in an expert. And he showed me ways of saving I had never dreamed of." "What kind of expert would you advise here?" Edith's small lip curled in scorn. "Domestic science, naturally. I have a woman who does nothing else. She shows women in their homes just how to make money count the most." "What women and what home? Tenements?" "Yes, she's one of my teachers." "Thank you," said Edith indignantly. "But I don't care to have my children brought down to tenement standards." "I didn't mean to have them. But I know she would show you a great many things you can buy for less." "I'm afraid I shouldn't agree with her." "Why not, Edith?" "Because she knows only tenement children. Nothing of children bred like mine." Deborah drew a quick short breath. Her brows drew tight and she looked away. She bit her lip, controlled herself. "Very well, I'll try again. This house is plenty large enough so that by a little crowding We could make room for somebody else. And I know a teacher in one of my schools who'd be only too glad." "Take in a boarder, you mean?" "Yes, I do. We've got to do something." "No!" Deborah threw up her hands. "All right, Edith, I'm through," she said. "Now what do you propose?" "I can try to do without Hannah again. That will be hard on all of us, but I guess you'll have to. So it seems. But unfortunately that won't be enough." Edith's face grew tenser. "I'm afraid it will have to be, just now. I've had all I can stand for one night." "I'm sorry," Deborah answered. For a moment they confronted each other. And Edith's look said to Deborah plainly, "You're spending thousands on those tenement children. You can get money enough for them, but you won't raise a hand to help with mine." And as plainly Deborah answered, "My children are starving, shivering, freezing. What do yours know about being poor?" Two mothers, each with a family, and each one baffled, brought to bay. There was something so insatiable in each angry mother's eyes. "I think you'd better leave this to me," said Roger very huskily, and both his daughters turned with a start, as though in their bitter absorption they had forgotten his presence there. Both flushed, and now the glances of all three in that room avoided each other, for they felt how sordid it had been. Deborah turned to her sister. "I'm sorry, Edith," she said again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. "So am I," said Edith unsteadily, and in a moment she left the room. Deborah stood watching her father. "I'm ashamed of myself," she said. "Well, shall we talk it over?" "No," he replied, "I can manage it somehow, Deborah, and I prefer that you leave it to me." Roger went into his study and sank grimly into his chair. Yes, it had been pretty bad. It had been ugly, ominous. He took paper and pencil and set to work. How he had come to hate this job of wrestling with figures. Of the $5,000 borrowed in August, he had barely $1,000 left. The first semi-annual interest was due next week and must be paid. The balance would carry them through March and on well into April. By that time he hoped to be making money, for business was better every week. But what of this $900 in debt? Half at least must be paid at once. Lower and lower he sank in his chair. But a few moments later his blunt, heavy visage cleared, and with a little sigh of relief he put away his papers, turned out the lights, and went upstairs. The dark house felt friendly and comforting now. In his room he opened the safe in the corner where his collection of curious rings had lain unnoticed for many months. He drew out a tray, sat down by the light and began to look them over. At first only small inanimate objects. Gradually, as from tray after tray they glittered duskily up at him, they began to yield their riches as they had so often done before. Spanish, French, Italian, Bohemian, Hungarian, Russian, and Arabian, rings small and rings enormous, religious rings and magic rings, poison rings, some black with age for all his careful polishing. Again they stole deep into Roger's imagination with suggestions of the many hands that had worn them through the centuries, of women kneeling in old churches, couples in dark crooked streets, adventures, love, hate, jealousy, youth and fire, dreams and passion. At last he remembered why he was here. He thought of possible purchasers. He knew so many dealers, but he knew too that the war had played the devil with them as with everyone else. Still he thought of several who would find it hard to resist the temptation. He would see them tomorrow, one by one, and get them bidding, haggling. Roger frowned disgustedly. No help for it, though. And it was a relief. It would bring a truce in his house for a time. But the truce was brief. On the afternoon when he sold his collection, Roger came home all out of sorts. He had been forced to haggle long. It had been a mean, inglorious day. One of the brightest paths in his life had ended in a pigsty. But at least he had bought some peace in his home. Women, women, women. He shut the front door with a slam and went up to his room for a little rest, a little of what he had paid for. On the stairs he passed young Betsy, and he startled the girl by the sudden glare of reproach he bestowed upon her. Savagely he told himself he was no feminist that night. The brief talk he had with Edith was far from reassuring. With no Deborah there to wound her pride, Edith quickly showed herself friendly to her father. But when he advised her to keep her nurse, she at once refused to consider it. "I want you to," he persisted, with an anxious note in his voice. He had tried life without Hannah here, and he did not care to try it again. "It is already settled, father. I sent her away this morning." "Then you get her right back," he exclaimed. But Edith's face grew obstinate. "I don't care to give Deborah," she replied, "another chance to talk as she did." Roger looked at her gloomily. "You will, though," he was thinking. "You two have only just begun. Let any little point arise which a couple of men would settle offhand, and you two will get together and go it. There'll be no living in the house." With deepening displeasure he watched the struggle between them go on. Sometimes, it seemed to Roger, there was not a topic he could bring up which would not in some way bring on a clash. One night in desperation he proposed the theater. "I'm afraid we can't afford it," said Edith, glancing at Deborah, and she had the same answer again and again for the requests her children made, if they involved but the smallest expense. "No, dear, I'm afraid we can't afford that," she would say gently, with a sigh. And under this constant pressure, these nightly little thrusts and jabs, Deborah would grow rigid with annoyance and impatience. "For heaven's sake, Edith," she burst out one night when the children had gone to their lessons, "can you think of nothing on earth except your own little family?" "Here it comes again," thought Roger, scowling into his paper. He heard Edith's curt reply. "No, I can't. Not nowadays. Nobody else seems to think of them." "You mean that I don't?" "Do you?" "Yes, I'm thinking of George. Do you want him killed in the trenches, in a war with Germany or Japan?" "Are you utterly mad?" demanded Edith. "No, I'm awake, my eyes are open, but yours are shut so tight, my dear, you can't see what has happened. You know this war has made us poor, and your own life harder, but that's all. The big thing it has done you know nothing about." "Suppose you teach me," Edith said, with a prim, provoking little smile. Deborah turned on her angrily. "It has shown that all such mothers as you are out of date and have got to change, that we're bound together all over the world whether we like it or whether we don't, and that if we want to keep out of war we've got to do it by coming right out of our own little homes. And thinking, Edith, thinking." "Votes for women," Edith said. Deborah looked at her, rose with a shrug. "All right, Edith, I give up." "Thank you, I'm not worth it. You'd better go back to your office now and go on with your work of saving the world, and use every hour of your time and every dollar you possess. I'll stay here and look after my children." Deborah had gone into the hall. Roger, buried deep in his paper, heard the heavy street door close. He looked up with a feverish sigh and saw at the open door of his study George and Betsy standing, curious, solemn, and wide-eyed. How long had they been listening? Chapter 35. There came a season of sleet and rain when the smaller children were shut indoors, and it was hard to keep them amused. They did not look well, and Edith was worried. She had always dreaded the spring, and to carry her family safely through, she had taken them in former years to Atlantic City for 2 weeks. That, of course, was impossible now. Trouble was bound to come, she thought, and it was not long in coming. Bobby, who was 10 years old and went to school with his brother George, caught a wretched cold one day. Edith popped him into bed, but despite her many precautions he gave his cold to Bruce and Tad. "Suppose I ask Allan Baird to come," Deborah suggested. "He's wonderful with children, you know." Edith curtly accepted his services. She felt he had been sent for to prevent her getting Dr. Lake, but she said nothing. She would wait. Through long hard days and longer nights she slaved upstairs. All Deborah's proffers of aid she declined. She kept Elizabeth home from school to help her with the many meals, the medicines, and the endless tasks of keeping her lively patients in bed. She herself played with them by the hour, while the ache in her head was a torment. At night she was up at the slightest sound. Heavy circles came under her eyes. Within a few days her baby, Bruce, had developed pneumonia. That evening after dinner, while Deborah was sitting with Roger in the living room, she heard her sister coming downstairs. She listened acutely, and glancing around she saw that Roger was listening too. Edith passed the doorway and went on down the hall, where they heard her voice at the telephone. She came back and looked in at the door. "I've called Dr. Lake," she said. "I've just taken Bruce's temperature. It's 105 2/5." Deborah glanced up with a start. "Oh, Edith," she said softly. Her sister turned and looked at her. "I ought to have had him before," she said. "When he comes, please bring him right up to the room." And she hurried upstairs. "Pshaw," breathed Roger anxiously. He had seen Bruce an hour ago, and the sight of the tiny boy, so exhausted and so still, had given him a sudden scare. Could it be that this would happen? Roger rose and walked the floor. Edith was right, he told himself. They should have had Lake long before. And they would have, by George, if it had not been for Deborah's interference. He glanced at her indignantly. "Bringing in Baird to save money, hey? Well, it was just about time they stopped saving money on their own flesh and blood. What had Bruce to do with tenement babies?" But he had had tenement treatment, just that. Deborah had had her way at last with Edith's children, and one of them might have to pay with its life. Again Roger glared at his silent daughter, and now, even in his excited state, he noticed how still and rigid she was, how unnatural the look she bent on the book held tightly in her hands. Still Deborah said nothing. She could feel her father's anger. Both he and Edith held her to blame. She felt herself in a position where she could not move a hand. She was stunned and could not think clearly. A vivid picture was in her mind, vivid as a burning flame which left everything else in darkness. It was of Bruce, one adorable baby, fighting for breath. "What would I do if he were mine?" When the doctor arrived, she took him upstairs and then came down to her father. "Well?" he demanded. "I don't know. We'll have to wait." And they both sat silent. At last they heard a door open and close, and presently steps coming down the stairs. Roger went out into the hall. "Come right in here, doctor, won't you? I want to hear about this myself." "Very well, sir." And Lake entered the room, with Edith close behind him. He took no notice of anyone. "Write this down," he said to her, "and give it to the nurse when she comes." A heavy man of middle age, with curious dark, impassive eyes that at times showed an ironic light. Lake was a despot in a world of mothers to whom his word was law. He was busy tonight with no time to waste, and his low, harsh voice now rattled out orders which Edith wrote down in feverish haste. An hourly schedule, night and day. He named a long list of things needed at once. "Night nurse will be here in an hour," he ended. "Day nurse tomorrow 8 a.m. Get sleep yourself, and plenty of it. As it is, you're not fit to take care of a cat." Abruptly he turned and left the room. Edith followed. The street door closed, and in a moment after that his motor was off with a muffled roar. Edith came back, picked up her directions and turned to her sister. "Will you go up and sit with Bruce?" "I'll telephone the druggist," she said. Deborah went to the sick room. Bruce's small face, peaked and gray in the soft dim light, turned as she entered and came to the bed. "Well, dear?" she whispered. The small boy's eyes, large and heavy with fever, looked straight into hers. "Sick," said the baby hoarsely. The next instant he tossed up his hands and went through a spasm, trying to breathe. It passed, he relaxed a little, and again stared solemnly at his aunt. "Sick," he repeated. "Woey sick." Deborah sat silent. The child had another fight for his breath, and this time as he did so, Deborah's body contracted too. A few moments later Edith came in. Deborah returned downstairs, and for over an hour she sat by herself. Roger was in his study. Betsy and George had gone to bed. The night nurse arrived and was taken upstairs. Still Deborah's mind felt numb and cold. Instinctively, again and again, it kept groping toward one point. If I had a baby as sick as that, what would I do? What would I do? When the doorbell rang again, she frowned, rose quickly, and went to the door. It was Allan. "Allan, come in here, will you?" she said, and he followed her into the living room. "What is it?" he inquired. "Bruce is worse." "Oh, I'm sorry. Why didn't Edith let me know?" "She had Lake to night," said Deborah. He knitted his brows in annoyance, then smiled. "Well, I don't mind that," he replied. "I'm rather glad. She'll feel easier now. What did he tell her?" "He seemed to consider it serious, by the number of things he ordered." "2 nurses, of course." "Yes, day and night." Deborah was silent a moment. "I may be wrong," she continued, "but I still feel sure the child will live. But I know it means a long, hard fight. The expense of it all will be heavy." "Well, whatever it is, I'll meet it," she said. "Father can't, he has reached the end. But even if he could help, still, it wouldn't make much difference in what I've been deciding. Because when I was with Bruce tonight, I saw as clear as I see you now that if I had a child like that, as sick as that, I'd sacrifice anything, everything. Schools, tenement children, thousands. I'd use the money which should have been theirs, and the time and attention. I'd shut them all out. They could starve if they liked. I'd be like Edith. Exactly. I'd center on this one child of mine." Deborah turned her eyes to his, stern and gleaming with her pain, and she continued sharply. "But I don't mean to shut those children out. And so it's clear as day to me that I can't ever marry you." That baby tonight was the finishing stroke. She made a quick, restless movement. Baird leaned slowly forward. Her hands in her laps were clenched together. He took them both and held them hard. "No, this isn't clear," he said. "I can feel it in your hands. This is nerves. This is the child upstairs. This is Edith in the house. This is school, the end of the long winter's strain. No, it's what I've decided." "But this is the wrong decision," Allan answered steadily. "It's made." "Not yet. It isn't. Not tonight. We won't talk of it now. You're in no condition." Deborah's wide, sensitive lips began to quiver suddenly. "We will talk of it now or never at all. I want it settled, done with. I've had enough. It's killing me." "No," was Allan's firm reply. "In a few days things will change. Edith's child will be out of danger. Your other troubles will clear away." "But what of next winter? And the next? What of Edith's children? Can't you see what a load they are on my father? Can't you see he's aging fast?" "Suppose he dies," Baird answered. "It will leave them on your hands. You'll have these children, won't you? Whether you marry or whether you don't. And so will I. I'm their guardian." "That won't be the same," she cried. as having children of our own. Look into my eyes." "I'm looking." Her own eyes were bright with tears. "Why are you always so afraid of becoming a mother?" Allan asked. In his gruff, low voice was a fierce appeal. "It's this obsession in your mind that you'll be a mother like Edith. And that's absurd. You never will. You say you're afraid of not keeping school the first thing in your life. But you always do and you always will. You're putting it ahead of me now." "Yes, I can put it ahead of you. But I couldn't put it ahead of my child." He winced at this, and she noticed it. "Because you are strong, and the child would be weak. The child would be like Bruce tonight." "Are you sure if you marry you must have a child?" "Yes," she answered huskily. "If I married you I'd want a child. And that want in me would grow and grow until it made both of us wretched. I'm that kind of woman. That's why my work has succeeded so far. Because I've a passion for children. They're not my work, they're my very life." She bowed her head. Her mouth set hard. "But so are you," she whispered. "And since this is settled, Allan, what do you think? Shall we try to go on, working together side by side, seeing each other every day as we have been doing all these months? Rather hard on both of us, don't you think?" "I do. I feel that way," she said. Again her features quivered. "The kind of feeling I have for you would make that rather difficult." His grip tightened on her hands. "I won't give you up," he said. "Later you will change your mind." He left the room and went out of the house. Deborah sat rigid. She trembled and the tears came. She brushed them angrily away. Struggling to control herself, presently she grew quieter. Frowning, with her clear gray eyes intently staring before her, she did not see her father come into the doorway. He stopped with a jerk at the sight of her face. "What's the matter?" he asked. She started. "Nothing's the matter." "How is Bruce?" "I don't know." "Who went out a few minutes ago?" "Allan Baird," she answered. "Oh, you explained to him, of course, about Lake?" "Yes, he understands," she said. "He won't come here after this." Roger looked at her sharply, wondering just what she meant. He hesitated. No, he would wait. "Good night," he said, and went upstairs. End of section 11. Recording by James Carson. Section 12 of His Family. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Carson. His Family by Ernest POOLE. Chapter 36. On the morrow, Bruce did not grow better. If anything, the child grew worse. But by the next morning, the crisis had passed. In the house the tension relaxed, and Roger suddenly felt so weak that he went to see his own physician. They had a long and serious talk. Later he went to his office, but he gave little heed to his work. Sitting there at his desk, he stared through the window far out over the city. A plan was forming in his mind. At home that night, at dinner, he kept watching Deborah, who looked tired and pale and rather relaxed. And as soon as she was out of the house, he telephoned Allan to come at once. "It's something which can't wait," he urged. "Very well, I'll come right up." When Baird arrived a little later, Roger opened the door himself, and they went back into his study. "Sit down," he said. "Smoke, Allan?" "No, thanks." Baird looked doubly tall and lean, his face had a gaunt appearance, and as he sat down, his lithe, supple right hand slowly closed on the arm of his chair. "Now then," began Roger, "there are two things we want to get clear on. The first is about yourself and Deborah. There has been trouble, hasn't there?" "Yes." "She has made up her mind not to marry you?" "Yes." "I guessed as much," and Roger paused. "Do you mind my asking questions?" "No." "Are you still in love with her, Allan?" "I am." "And she with you?" "I think so." "Then it's the same old trouble." "Yes." And he told a part of what she had said. As he talked in clear, terse, even tones, Baird's steady eyes had a tortured light, the look of a man who has almost reached the end of his endurance. Roger smoked in silence. "What do you propose to do?" "Wait," said Allan. "A few more days. Then try again. If I fail, I'm through." Roger shot a quick look at him. "I don't think you'll fail, my boy. And what's more, I think I can help you. This is a large house, Allan. There's more in it than you know. My second point concerns myself. I'm going to die within a year." As Baird turned on him suddenly, Roger grimly smiled and said, "We won't go into the details. But I've been examined lately, and I have quite positive knowledge of what I've suspected for some time. So far I have told no one but you. And I'm telling you only because of the bearing it has on Deborah." Roger leaned forward heavily. "She's the one of my daughters who means the most, now that I'm so near the end. When I die next year, that may be all. I may simply end, a blank, a grave. I am not sure. But I've made up my mind above everything else to see Deborah happy before I go. And I mean to do it by setting her free. So free I think it will frighten her." Roger went on to explain his plan, and they talked together for some time. Another week had soon gone by. Bruce still recovered rapidly, and the other sick children were up and about. Deborah, in the meantime, had barely been in the house at all. But late on Saturday evening Roger found her in her room. She was working. He came behind her. "What is it, Dad?" "Busy, hey?" He hesitated and laid his hand on her shoulder with a little affectionate pressure. "You've kept so busy lately," he said. "I haven't had time to see anything of you. How's your work going?" "Much better, thanks, now that the winter is over." He questioned her about her schools, and then after a brief pause, "Well, daughter," he said, "it has been a great fight, and I'm proud of you for it. And if I've got anything to say," his hand was still on her shoulder, and he felt her tighten suddenly, "it isn't by way of criticism. Please be sure of that ahead. In this damnable war, my faith in men has been badly shaken up. Humanity seems to me still a child who needs to go to school. God knows we need men and women like you. And I'm proud of all you've accomplished. I'd be the last man to hold you back. I only want to help you go on, by seeing to it that you are free from anything that can hinder you." He stopped again for a moment. "To begin with," he said, "I understand you're not going to marry Allan Baird." She stirred slightly. "Did he tell you so?" "Yes, I asked him," Roger replied. "I had Allan here a few nights ago, and he told me you had decided to give up your happiness for the sake of all those children in that big family of yours. You felt you must keep yourself free for them. Very well, if that is your decision, I propose to clear the way." She looked intently up at his face. "You're not free now," he continued. "We have Edith and her children here. And I'm growing old. That has got to be thought of. I don't want to leave them on your hands. So as soon as the baby is well enough, I'm going to move them to the mountains. Not only for the summer. They are to stay the whole year round. From this time on they're to make it their home." "Father, but they can't do that. Think of the winters!" Deborah cried. "It's already settled," he answered. "I've talked to Edith and she has agreed. She has always loved the farm, and it will be good for her children. In the meantime I've been talking to George. 'George,' I told him, 'I'm going to talk to you man to man about a man's job I want you to tackle.' 'The farm?' 'But, dearie, he's only a boy.' 'He's nearly 17,' said Roger, 'and a young moose for his age. And old Dave Royce will still be there. It's the work George has been dreaming about ever since he was a child. You should have seen how he was thrilled by the scheme. I told him we'd spend the summer together up there, laying all our plans, investing our money carefully to make every dollar count." "What money?" Deborah sharply asked. But her father was talking steadily on. "We already have a fine lot of cattle. We'll add to it and enlarge the barn and put in some new equipment. In short, we'll put it in fine shape, make it a first-class dairy farm. And then, George," I said to him, "I'm going to turn it over to you. I shall give the farm to your mother, and the rest of the money I have I mean to invest in her name down here, so that she'll have a small income until you can make your dairy pay." "What money are you speaking of?" Deborah's voice was thick and hard, her sensitive lips were parted, and she was breathing quickly. "I've sold the house," he told her. Convulsively she gripped his arms. "Then tell me where you mean to live." "I'm not going to live. I'm going to die very soon. I have definite knowledge." Without speaking, Deborah rose. Her face went white. Her father kept tight hold of her hands, and he felt them trembling, growing cold. "You're soon to be free of everyone," he continued painfully. "I know this is hurting you, but I see so plain, my child, just what it is I've got to do. I'm trying to clear the way for you to make a simple, definite choice. A choice which is going to settle your life one way or the other. I want to make sure you see what you're doing. Because you mean so much to me. You're flesh and blood, my daughter? And in this family of ours, we've been the closest ones of all." She seemed to sway a little. "You're not going to die," she whispered. "So it hurts you to lose me," he replied. "It will be hard to be so free. Would you rather not have had me at all? I've been quite a load on your back, you know. A fearful job you had of it, dragging me up when I was down, and since then Edith and Bruce and the rest, what burdens they have been at times. What sharp worries, heavy sorrows, days and night, you and I have gone through, when we should have been quietly resting, free, to keep up our strength for our next day's work. Suppose you had missed them, lived alone, would you have worked better? You don't know, but you will know soon. You're to give it a trial. For I've cleared the way, so that if you throw over Baird, to be free you shall get the freedom you feel you need." "Father, please, is it fair? Is this kind?" she asked in a harsh, frightened tone. Her eyes were wet with angry tears. "This isn't a time to be kind, my dear." His voice was quivering like her own. I'm bungling it. But you must let me stumble along and try to show you what I mean. You will have your work, your crowded schools, to which you'll be able to give your life. But I look ahead, I know you, and I don't see you happy. I don't even see you whole. For you there will be no family. None of the intimate sorrows and joys that have been in this house will come to you. I look back and I see them all. For a man who has come so near, the end gets a larger vision." He shut his eyes, his jaw set tight. "I look into my family back, and I see how it has been made of many generations. Certain figures stand out in my mind. They cover over 100 years, and I see how much they've meant to me. I see that I've been one of them, a link in a long chain of lives, all interbound and reaching on. In my life they have all been there, as I shall be in lives to come. And this is what I want for you." He held her close a moment. The tears were rolling down her cheeks. "Until now you have been one of us too. You have never once been free. You have been the one in this house to step in and take hold and try to decide what's best to be done. I'm not putting you up on a pedestal. I don't say you've made no mistakes, but I say you're the kind of woman who craves what's in a family. You're the one of my daughters who has loved this house the most." "Yes," she said, "I've loved this house. But now for you all this will stop, quite suddenly," he told her. "This house of ours will soon be sold, and within a few months I shall be dead, and your family will have dropped out of your life. Stop, can't you? Stop, it's brutal. It isn't true about you," she cried. "I won't believe it." Her voice broke. "Go and see my physician," he said. "How long have you known it? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because we had troubles enough as it was, other things to think of. But there's only one thing now, this freedom you are facing." "Please, please," she cried imploringly. "I don't want to talk of myself, but of you." "This physician." "No," he answered with stern pain. "You'll have to hear me out, my child. We're talking of you alone when I am gone. How will it be? Are you quite sure? You will have your work, that vision of yours, and I know how close it has been to you, vivid and warm, almost like a friend. But so was my business once like that, when I was as young as you. And the business grew and it got cold, impersonal, a mere machine. Thank God I had a family. Isn't your work growing too? Are you sure it won't become a machine? And won't you lose touch with the children then, unless you have a child of your own? Friends won't be enough, you'll find. They're not bound up into yourself. The world may reach a stage at last where we shall live on in the lives of all. We may all be one big family. But that time is still far off. We hold to our own flesh and blood. And so I'm sure it will be with you. You see, you have been young, my dear, and your spirit has been fresh and new. But how are you going to keep it so, without the ties you've always had?" He felt the violent clutch of her hand. "You won't die," she whispered. But he went on relentlessly. "And what will you do without Allan Baird? For you see, you have not even worked alone. You have had this man who has loved you there. I've seen how much he has helped you, how you have grown, and he has grown, since you two got together. And if you throw him over now, it seems to me you are not only losing what has done the most for your work, but you're running away from life as well. You've never won by doing that. You've always won by meeting life, never evading it, taking it all, living it full, taking chances. If you marry Baird, I see you both go on together in your work. While in your home you struggle through the troubles, tangles, joys and griefs which most of us mortals know so well. I see you in a world of children, but with children too of your own, to keep your spirit always young, living on in your children's lives." Roger stopped abruptly. He groped for something more to say. "On the one side all that," he muttered, "and on the other a lonely life which shall soon grow old." There fell a dangerous silence. And sharply, without warning, the influence deep and invisible of many generations of stolid folk in New England made itself felt in each of them. Father and daughter grew awkward both. The talk had been too emotional. Each made, as by an instinct, a quick, strong effort at self-control, and felt about for some way to get back upon their old easy footing. Roger turned to his daughter. Her head was still bent, her hands clasped tight, but she was frowning down at them now, although her face was still wet with tears. She drew a deep, unsteady breath. "Well, Deborah," he said simply, "here I've gone stumbling on like a fool. I don't know what I've said or how you have listened." "I've listened," she said thickly. "I have tried," he went on in a steadier tone, "to give you some feeling of what is ahead, and to speak for your mother as well as myself. And more than that, much more than that, for the world has changed since she was here. God knows I've tried to be modern." A humorous glint came into his eyes. "Downright modern," he declared. "Have I asked you to give up your career? Not at all. I've asked you to marry Baird and go right on with him in your work. And if you can't marry Allan Baird, after what he has done for you, how, in God's name, can you modern women ever marry anyone? Now, what do you say? Will you marry him? Don't laugh at me. I'm serious. Talk." But Deborah was laughing, although her father felt her hands still cold and trembling in his. Her gray eyes, bright and luminous, were shining up into his own. "What a time you've been having, haven't you, dear?" his daughter cried unsteadily. "Fairly lying awake at night and racking your brain for everything modern I've ever said, to turn it and twist it and use it against me." "Well," he demanded, "how does it twist?" "It twists hard, thank you," she declared. "You've turned and twisted me about till I barely see how I can live at all." "You can, though. Marry Allan Baird." "I'll think it over later on." "What is there left to think about? Can you point to one hole in all I've said?" "Yes, a good many, and one right off." "Out with it." "You're not dying," Deborah told him calmly. "I feel quite certain you'll live for years." "Oh, you do, hey? Then see my physician." "I will. I'll see him to morrow." "How long did you give yourself? Just a few months?" "No, he said it might be more," admitted Roger grudgingly. "If I had no worries to wear me out." "Me, you mean?" "Exactly." "Well, you've worried quite enough. You're going to leave it to me to decide." "Very well," he agreed. He looked at her. "You have listened hard?" he gruffly asked. "Yes, dear." Her hand slowly tightened on his. "But don't speak of this again. You're to leave it to me. You promise?" "Yes." And Roger left her. He went to bed, but he could not sleep. With a sudden sag in his spirits, he felt what a bungler he had been. He was not used to these solemn talks, he told himself irately. What a fool to try it! And how had Deborah taken it all? He did not mind her laughter, nor that lighter tone of hers. It was only her way of ending the talk, an easy way out for both of them. But what had she thought underneath? Had his points gone home? He tried to remember them. Pshaw! He had been too excited, and he could recall scarcely anything. He had not meant to speak of Baird. He had meant to leave him out. Yes, how he must have bungled it. Doubtless she was smiling still. Even the news about himself she had not taken seriously. But as he thought about that news, Roger's mood completely changed. The talk of the evening grew remote, his family no longer real, mere little figures, shadowy, receding swiftly far away. Much quieter now. He lay a long time listening to the life of the house, the occasional sounds from the various rooms. From the nursery adjoining came little Bruce's piping laugh, and Roger could hear the nurse moving about. Afterwards, for a long time, he could hear only creaks and breathings. Never had the old house seemed so like a living creature. For nearly 40 years he had held all that he had loved and known, all he had been sure of. Outside of it was the strange, the new, the uncertain, the vast unknown, stretching away to infinity. Again he heard Bruce's gay little laugh. What did it remind him of? He puzzled. Then he had it. Edith had been a baby here. Her cradle had been in this very room, close by the bed. And how she had laughed! What gurgles and ripples of bursting glee! The first child in his family. Chapter 37. On the next day, which was Sunday, Deborah made an appointment with her father's physician and had a long talk with him at his house. Upon her return she went to her room and stayed there until evening, but when she came down to supper her manner was as usual. At the table she joined in the talk of Edith and the children, already deep in their preparations for the move up to the farm. George could hardly wait to start. That life would be a change indeed in Edith's plans for her family, and as they talked about it now, the tension of hostility which had so long existed between the two sisters passed away. Each knew the clash had come to an end, that they would live together no more, and as though in remorse they drew close. Deborah with her suggestions, Edith in her friendly way of taking and discussing each one. Then Deborah went again to her room. Her room was just over Roger's, and waking several times in the night, he heard his daughter walking the floor. The next day she was up early and off to her school before he came down. It was a fine spring morning. Roger had had a good night's sleep, and as he walked to his office he was buoyed up by a feeling both of hope for his daughter and of solid satisfaction in himself, as he remembered all he had said to her. Curiously enough, he could recall every word of it now. Every point which he had made rose up before him vividly. How clear he had been, how simple and true, and yet with what a tremendous effect he had piled the points one on the other. By George, he thought with a little glow, for a fellow who's never been in a pulpit, I put up a devilish strong appeal. And he added sagely, let it work on the girl, give it a chance. She'll come out of this all right. This idea that some fellows have, that every woman is born a fool, isn't fair, it isn't true. Just let a line of argument be presented to her strong and clear, straight from the shoulder by some man. And again, with a tingle of pleasure, his mind recurred to his sermon. His pleasures had been few of late, so he dwelt on this little glow of pride and made the most of it while it was here. At the office, as he entered his room, he stopped with a slight shock of surprise. John, standing on his crutches in front of a large table, had been going through the morning's mail, sorting out the routine letters Roger did not need to see. Today he had just finished and was staring at the window. The light fell full on his sallow face and showed an amazing happiness. At Roger's step he started. "Well, Johnny, how goes it this morning?" "Fine, thank you," was the prompt reply. And John hobbled briskly over to his typewriter in the corner. Roger sat down at his desk. As he did so, he glanced again at the cripple and felt a little pang of regret. "What will become of him," he asked, "when I close out my business?" He still thought of him as a mere boy, for looking at the small crooked form, it was difficult to remember that John was 20 years of age. The lad had worked like a Trojan of late. Even Roger, engrossed as he had been in family anxieties, had noticed it in the last few weeks. He would have to make some provision for John. Deborah would see to it. Roger went slowly through his mail. One letter was from the real estate firm through whom he was to sell the house. The deal had not been closed as yet. There were certain points still to be settled. So Roger called John to his desk and dictated a reply. When he finished, there was a brief pause. "That's all," said Roger gruffly. "So you're selling the house?" John ventured. "Yes." The lad limped back to his corner and went to work at his machine. But presently he came over again and stood waiting awkwardly. "What is it, Johnny?" Roger inquired, without looking up. "Say, Mr. Gale," the boy began in a careful, casual tone, "would you mind talking business a minute or two?" "No, fire ahead." "Well, sir, you've had your own troubles lately. You haven't had much time for things here. The last time you went over the books was nearly a couple of weeks ago." John paused, and his look was portentous. "Well," asked Roger, "what about it? Business been picking up since then?" "Yes, sir," was the answer. "We didn't lose a cent last week. We made money, $15. Good Lord, Johnny, we're getting rich. But that's nothing," John continued. "The fact of the matter is, Mr. Gale, I have been working lately on a new line I thought of. And now it's got a-going so fast it's getting clean away from me." Again he stopped and swallowed hard. "Out with it then," said Roger. "I got it from the war," said John. "The papers are still half full of war news, and that's what's keeping our business down, because we ain't adapting ourselves to the new war conditions. So I figured it like this. Say there are 1 million people over here in America who've got either friends or relations in the armies over there. Say that all of 'em want to get news, not just this stuff about battles, but real live news of what's happened to Bill. Has Bill still got his legs and arms? Can he hold down a job when he gets home? News which counts for something. See? A big new market. Business for us. So I tried to see what I could do." John excitedly shifted his crutches. Roger was watching intently. "Go on, Johnny." "Sure, I'll go on. One night I went to a library where they have English papers. I went over their files for about a month. I took one Canadian regiment, see, and traced it through, and I got quite a story. Then I used some of the money I've saved and bought a whole bunch of papers. I piled 'em up in the room where I sleep and went through 'em nights. I hired 2 kids to help me. Well, Mr. Gale, the thing worked fine. In less than a week I had any amount of little bunches of clippings. See how I mean? Each bunch was a story of one regiment for a month, so I knew we could deliver the goods. Well, this was about 10 days ago, and then I went after the market. I went to a man I met last year in an advertising office, and for $50 we put an ad in the Sunday Times. After that there was nothing to do but wait. The next day, nothing doing. I was here at 7:30 and I went through every mail, not a single answer to my ad, and I thought I was busted. But Tuesday morning there were 3, with $5 checks inside of 'em. In the afternoon there were 2 more, and the next day 11. By the end of last week we had 46. Friday I put in another ad, and there've been over 70 more since then. That makes 120 in all, $600, and I'm swamped. I ain't done nothing yet. I've just kept 'em all for you to see." He went quickly to the table, gathered a pile of letters there, and brought them over to Roger's desk. Roger glanced over a few of them, dazed. He looked around into John's shrewd face, where mingled devotion and triumph and business zeal were shining. "Johnny," he said huskily, "you've adopted my business and no mistake." John swallowed again and scowled with joy. "Let's figure it out," he proposed. "We will." They were at it all day, laying their plans, adapting the work of the office to the new conditions. They found they would need a larger force, including a French and a German translator. They placed other ads in the papers. They forgot to have lunch and worked steadily on till the outer rooms were empty and still. At last they were through. Roger wearily put on his cuffs and went and got his coat and hat. "Say, Mr. Gale," John asked, "how about this letter, the one you dictated this morning to that firm about your house?" Roger turned and looked at him. "Throw it in the basket," he said. "We'll write 'em another to morrow and tell 'em we have changed our minds." He paused for just a moment, and then he added brusquely, "If this goes through, as I hope it will, I guess you'd better come into the firm." And he left the room abruptly. Behind him there was not a sound. At home in his study that evening he made some more calculations. In a few weeks he would have money enough to start Edith and her family in their new life on the farm. For the present, at least, the house was safe. "Why, Father," Edith came into the room, "I didn't know you had come home. What kept you so long at the office?" "Oh, business, my dear." "Have you had any supper?" "No, and I'd like some," he replied. "I'll see to it myself," she said. Edith was good at this sort of thing, and the supper she brought was delicious. He ate it with keen relish. Then he went back to his study and picked up a book, an old favorite. He started to read, but presently dozed. The book dropped from his hands and he fell asleep. He awakened with a start and saw Deborah looking down at him. For a moment he stared up as he came to his senses, and in his daughter's clear gray eyes he thought he saw a happiness which set his heart to beating fast. "Well?" he questioned huskily. "We're to be married right away." He stared a moment longer. "Oh, I'm so glad, my dear. I was afraid you—" He stopped short. Deborah bent close to him, and he felt her squeeze his arm. "I've been over and over all you said," she told him in a low sweet voice. "I had a good many ups and downs, but I'm all through now. I'm sure you were right." And she pressed her cheek to his. "Oh, Dad, it's such a relief. And I'm so happy. Thank you, dear." "Where is Allan?" he asked presently. "I'll get him," she said. She left the room, and in a moment Allan's tall, ungainly form appeared in the doorway. "Well, Allan, my boy," Roger cried. "Oh, Roger Gale," said Allan softly. He was wringing Roger's hand. "So she decided to risk you, eh?" Roger said unsteadily. "Well, Baird, you look like a devilish risk for a woman like her, who has the whole world on her back as it is." I know, and how rash she has been. Only 2 years and her mind was made up. But that's like her, that's our Deborah, always acting like a flash." "Stop acting like children," Deborah cried, "and be sensible and listen to me. We're to be married tomorrow morning." "Why tomorrow?" Roger asked. "Because," she said decidedly, "there has been enough fuss over this affair. So we'll just be married and have it done. And when Edith and the children go up next week to the mountains, we want to move right into this house." "This house?" exclaimed her father. "I know, it's sold," she answered, "but we're going to get a lease. We'll see the new owner and talk him around." "Then you'll have to talk your father around." "You around?" And Deborah stared. "You mean to say you're not going to sell?" "I do," said Roger blithely. He told them the story of John's new scheme. "And if things turn out in the office as he hoped they will," he ended, "we'll clear the mortgage on the house and then make it your wedding gift. From the new firm to the new family." Deborah choked a little. "Allan, what do you think of us now?" "I think," he answered in a drawl, "that we'd better try to persuade the new firm to live with the new family." "We will, and the sooner the better," she said. "I'm going up to the mountains," said Roger. "Yes, but you're coming back in the fall, and when you do you're coming here, and you're going to live here years and years." "You're forgetting my doctor." "Not at all. I had a long talk with him Sunday, and I know just what I'm saying." "You don't look it, my dear," said Roger. "But of course you may be right. If you take the proper care of me here, and John keeps booming things for the firm, and George makes a huge success of the farm," Deborah added quickly, "and Deborah of teaching the world." "Oh, Allan, hush up." "Look here," he said, "you go upstairs and tell Edith all this. Your father and I want to be alone." And when the two men were left alone, they smoked and said nothing. They smiled at each other. "It's hard to decide," grunted Roger at last. "Which did it, my wonderful sermon or your own long waiting game?" "I'm inclined to think it was the game. For any other man but you, with all you've done without any talk, no sir, there wouldn't have been a chance. But she's modern, Baird, she's modern. And I'm going to live just as long as I can. I want to see what happens here." The next night in his study, how quiet it was. Edith was busy packing upstairs. Deborah and Allan were gone. Thoughts drifted slowly across his mind. Well, she was married, the last of his daughters, the one whom he cared most for, the one who had taken the heaviest risks. And this was the greatest risk of all. For although she had put it happily out of her thoughts for the moment, Roger knew the old troublesome question was still there in Deborah's mind. The tenement children or her own, the big family or the small. He felt there would still be struggles ahead. And with a kind of a wistfulness he tried to see into the future here. He gave a sudden start in his chair. "By George," he thought, "they forgot the ring." Scowling, he tried to remember. Yes, in the brief simple service that day, in which so much had been omitted, music, flowers, wedding gown, even the ring had been left out. Why? Not from any principle, he knew that they were not such fools. No, they had simply forgotten it, in the haste of getting married at once. Well, by thunder, for a girl whose father had been a collector of rings for the best part of his natural life, it was pretty shabby, to say the least. Then he recollected that he too had forgotten it, and this quieted him immediately. "I'll get one though," he promised himself, "and no plain wedding ring either. I'll make A. Baird attend to that. No, I'll get her a ring worth while." He sank deep in his chair and took peace to his soul by thinking of the ring he would choose. And this carried his thoughts back over the years, for there had been so many rings. Chapter 38. It was a clear, beautiful afternoon toward the end of May, and as the train puffing up the grade wound along the Connecticut River, Roger sat looking out of the window. The orchards were pink and white on the hills. Slowly the day wore away. The river narrowed, the hills reared high, and in the sloping meadows gray ribs and shoulders of granite appeared. The air had a tang of the mountains. Everywhere were signs of spring, of new vigor and fresh life, but the voices at each station sounded drowsier than at the last. His eyes appeared more stolid, and to Roger it felt like a journey far back into the old ways of living, old beliefs and old ideals. He had always had this feeling, and always he had relished it, this dive into his boyhood. But it was different today, for this was more than a journey, it was a migration, too. Close about him in the car were Edith and her children, bound for a new home up there in the very heart and stronghold of all old things in America. Old things dear to Edith's heart. As she sat by the window staring out, he watched her shapely little head. He noted the hardening lines on her forehead and the gray which had come in her hair. It had been no easy move for her, this. She'd shown pluck to take it so quietly. He saw her smile a little, then frown and go on with her thinking. What was she thinking about, he wondered, all she had left behind in New York, or the rest of her life which lay ahead? She had always longed for things simple and old. Well, she would have them now with a vengeance, summer and winter the year round, in the battered frame house on the mountainside, the birthplace of her family. A recollection came to him of a summer's dusk 2 years ago, and a woman with a lawn-mower cutting the grass on the family graves. Would Edith ever be like that, a mere custodian of the past? If she did, he thought, she would be false to the very traditions she tried to preserve. For her forefathers had never been mere guardians of things gone by. Always they had been pioneers. That house had not been old to them, but a thrilling new adventure. Their old homes they had left behind, far down in the valleys to the east, and even those valley homes had been new to the rugged men come over the sea. Would Edith ever understand? Would she see that for herself the new must emerge from her children, from the ideas, desires, and plans already teeming in their minds? Would she show keen interest, sympathy? Would she be able to keep her hold? In the seat behind her mother, Betsy was sitting with Bruce on her lap, looking over a picture book. Quietly Roger watched the girl. "What are you going to be?" he asked. "A woman's college president, a surgeon, or a senator? What will your mother think of you then?" They changed cars, and on a train made up of antiquated coaches they wound through a side valley, down which, rushing and tumbling, came the river that bore Roger's name. He went into the smoking car, and presently George joined him there. George did not yet smoke with his elders, but he had bought a package of gum, and he was chewing absorbedly. Plainly the lad was excited over the great existence which he saw opening close ahead. Roger glanced at the boy's broad shoulders, noticed the eager lines of his jaw, looked down at his enormous hands, unformed as yet, ungainly. But in them was a hungriness that caused a glow in Roger's breast. One more of the family starting out. "It's all going to depend on you," Roger gravely counseled. "Your whole life will depend on the start you make. Either you're going to settle down like so many of your neighbors up there, or you're going to hustle, plan out your day, keep on with your studies and go to college. The State Agricultural College, I mean. In short, keep up to date, my boy, and become in time a big figure in farming." "I'm going to do it," George replied. His grandfather glanced again at his face, so scowling, so determined, and a gleam of compassion and yearning came for a moment in Roger's eyes. His heavy hand lay on George's knee. "That's right, son," he grunted. "Make the family proud of you. I'll do all I can to help you start. My business is picking up, thank God, and I'll be able to back you now. I'll stay up here a good part of the summer. We've both of us got a lot to learn, and not only from books. We want to remember we've plenty to learn from the neighbors, too. Take old Dave Royce, for instance, who, when all is said and done, has worked our farm for 20-odd years and never once run me into debt." "But gee," demurred George, "he's so way out of date." "I know he is, son, but we've got to go slow." And Roger's look passed furtively along the faces in the car. "We don't want to forget," he warned, "that this is still New England. Every new idea we have, we want to go easy with. Snake it in." "I've got an awful lot of 'em," the boy muttered hungrily. At the farm the next morning at daybreak, Roger was awakened by the sound of George's voice. It was just beneath his window. "But cattle are only part of it, Dave," the boy declared in earnest tones. "Just part of what we can have up here. Think what we've got, over 300 acres, and we want to make every acre count. We want to get in a whole lot more of hogs, belted Hampshires, and if we can afford 'em, and a couple of 100 hens. White Leghorns ought to fill the bill. Of course, that's just a starter. I've got a scheme for some incubators, electric, run by the dynamo which we'll put in down by the dam, and we can do wonders with bees, too. Dave, I've got a book on 'em I'd like you to read. And besides, there's a big money in squab these days. Rich women in New York hotel eat thousands of 'em every night. And ducks, of course, and turkeys. I'd like a white gobbler right at the start, if we knew where we could get one cheap." The voice broke off and there was a pause. "We can do an awful lot with this place." Then Dave's deep drawl. "That's so, George. Yes, I guess that's so. Only we don't want to fool ourselves. That ain't Noah's Ark over there. It's a barn. And just for a starter, if I was you," here Dave deliberated, "of course it's none of my business," he said. "It's for you and your grandfather to decide, and I don't propose to interfere in what ain't any of my affair." Yes, Dave, sure, that's all right. But go on, what just for starter?" "Cows," came the tranquil answer. "I've been hunting around since you wrote me last month, and I know of 3 good milkers." "3? Why, Dave, I wrote we want 30 or 40. "Yes, you wrote," Dave answered. "But I've drove around these parts, and there ain't but 3 that I can find. And I ain't so sure of that third one. She looks like she might—" George cut in. "But you only had a buggy, Dave." "Gee, I'm going to have a Ford." "That's so, George. You bet it's so. And we'll go on a cow hunt all over the state." "Well, I don't know, but you're right," Dave responded cautiously. "You might get more cows if you had a Ford, and got so you could run it. Yes, I guess it's a pretty good scheme. I believe in being conservative, George, but I don't know now but what a Ford—" Their voices passed from under the window, and Roger relaxed and smiled to himself. It was a good beginning, he thought. They bought a Ford soon afterward, and in the next few weeks of June they searched the farms for miles around, slowly adding to their herd. To Roger's surprise he found many signs of a new life stirring there. The farmers buying autos and improved machinery, thinking of new processes, and down in the lower valleys they found several big stock farms which were decidedly modern affairs. At one such place the man in charge took a fancy to George and asked him to drop over often. "You bet I'll drop over often," George replied, as he climbed excitedly into his Ford. "I want to see more of those milking machines. We're going to have 'em some day ourselves. A dynamo, too." And at home, down by the ruined mill, he again set about rebuilding the dam. Roger felt himself growing stronger. His sleeps were sound, and his appetite had come back to a surprising degree. The mountain air had gotten into his blood, and George's warm vigor into his soul. One afternoon, watching the herd come home, some 30 huge animals swinging along with a slow, heavy power in their limbs, he breathed the strong, sweet scent of them on the mountain breeze. George came running by them and stopped a moment by Roger's side, watching closely and eagerly every animal as it passed. And Roger glanced at George's face. The herd passed on, and George followed behind, his collie dog leaping and barking beside him. And Roger looked up at a billowy cloud resting on a mountain top, and wondered whether, after all, that New York doctor had been right. He followed the herd into the barn. In 2 long rows, the great heads of the cattle turned hungrily, lowing and sniffing deep, breathing harshly, stamping as the fodder cart came down the lines. What a splendidly wholesome work for a lad growing up with his roots in the soil, in these massive, simple forces of life. What of Edith's other children? Would they be willing to stay here long? Each morning Roger breakfasted with Bruce the baby by his side. "What a thing for you, little lad," he thought, "if you could live here all your days. But will you? Will you want to stay? Won't you too get the fever as I did for the city?" In the joyous, shining, mysterious eyes of the baby he found no reply. He had many long talks with Betsy, who was eager to go away to school, and with Bob and little Tad, who were going to school in the village that fall. And the feeling came to Roger that surely he would see these lives, at least for many years ahead. They were so familiar and so real, so fresh and filled with hopes and dreams, and he felt himself so a part of them all. But one morning, climbing the steep upper field to a spring George wanted to show him, Roger suddenly swayed, turned faint. He caught hold of a boulder on the wall and held himself rigid, breathing hard. It passed, and he looked at his grandson. But George had noticed nothing. The boy had turned, and his brown eyes were fixed on a fallow field below. Wistfully Roger watched his face. They both stood motionless for a long time. As the summer drew slowly to a close, Roger spent many quiet hours alone by the copse of birches, where the glory of autumn was already stealing in and out among the tall slender stems of the trees. And he thought of the silent winter there, and of the spring which would come again, and the long fragrant summer. And he watched the glow on the mountains above and the rolling splendors of the clouds. At dusk he heard the voices of animals, birds and insects, murmuring up from all the broad valley, then gradually sinking to deep repose, many never to wake again. And the span of his life, from the boyhood which he could recall so vividly here among these children, seemed brief to him as a summer's day, only a part of a mighty whole made up of the innumerable lives, the many generations of his family, his own flesh and blood, come out of a past he could never know, and going on without him now, branching, dividing, widening out to what his eyes would never see. Vaguely he pictured them groping their way just as he himself had done. It seemed to Roger that all his days he had been only entering life as some rich, bewildering thicket like this copse of birches here, never getting very deep, never seeing very clearly, never understanding all. And so it had been with his children, and so it was with these children of Edith's, and so it would be with those many others, always groping, blundering, starting. Children, only children all. And yet what lives they were to lead, what joys and revelations and disasters would be theirs, in the strange remote world they would live in, my flesh and blood that I never shall know. But the stars were quiet and serene. The meadows and the forests on the broad sweep of the mountain side took on still brighter, warmer hues, and there was no gloom in these long goodbyes. On a frosty night in September he left the farm to go to the city. From his seat in the small automobile Roger looked back at the pleasant old house with its brightly lighted windows, and then he turned to George by his side. "We're in good shape for the winter, son." But George did not get his full meaning. At the little station there were no other passengers. They walked the platform for some time. Then the train with a scream came around the curve. A quick grip on George's hand, and Roger climbed into the car. Inside, a moment later, he looked out through the window. By a trainman with a lantern, George stood watching, smiling up, and he waved his hand as the train pulled out. End of section 12. Recording by JCarson. Section 13 of His Family. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JCarson. His Family by Ernest POOLE. Chapter 39. The next morning on his arrival in town, Roger went to his office. He had little cause for uneasiness there, for twice in the summer he had come down to keep an eye on the business, while John had taken brief vacations at a seaside place nearby. The boy had no color now in his cheeks. As always, they were a sallow gray, with the skin drawn tight over high cheekbones. His vigor was all in his eyes. But here was a new John, nevertheless, a successful man of affairs. He had on a spruce new suit of brown, no cheap ready-made affair, but one carefully fitted to conceal and soften his deformity. He was wearing a bright blue tie and a cornflower in his buttonhole, and his sandy hair was sleekly brushed. He showed Roger into his private room, a small place he had partitioned off, where over his desk was a motto in gold: "This is no place for your troubles or mine." "Lord, but you've got yourself fixed up fine in here," said Roger. John smiled broadly. "And you're looking like a new man, Johnny." "I had a great time at the seashore. Learned to sail a boat alone. What do you think of this chair of mine?" And John complacently displayed the ingenious contrivance in front of his desk. Somewhat like a bicycle seat, it was made of steel and leather pads. "Wonderful," said Roger. "Where'd you ever pick it up?" "I had it made," was the grave reply. "When a fellow has got up in life enough to have a stenographer, it's high time he was sitting down." "Let's see you do it." John sat down. "Now, how is business?" Roger asked. "Great. Since the little slump we had in August, it has taken a new start. And not only war business at that. The old people are sending in orders again. I tell you what it is, Mr. Gale. This country is right on the edge of a boom." And the junior member of the firm tilted triumphantly back in his chair. With the solid comfort which comes to a man when he returns to find his affairs all going well, Roger worked until 5 o'clock, and then he started for his home. Deborah had not yet come in, and a deep silence reigned in the house. He looked through the rooms downstairs, and with content he noticed how little had been altered. His beloved study had not been touched. On the third floor, in the large back room, he found John comfortably installed. There were gay prints upon the walls, fresh curtains at the windows, a mandolin lying on a chair. And Roger, glancing down at the keen, glad face of his partner, told himself that the doctor had said this lad would die, was a fool. These doctors fool themselves often, he thought. Deborah and Allan had the front room on the floor below. Roger went in, and for a moment he stood looking about him. How restful and how radiant was this large old-fashioned chamber, so softly lighted, waiting. Through a passageway lined with cupboards he went into his room at the back. Deborah had repapered it, but with a pattern so similar that Roger did not notice the change. He only felt a vague freshness here, as though even this old chamber, too, was making a new start in life. And he felt as though he were to live here for years. Slowly he unpacked his trunk and took a bath and dressed at his leisure. Then he heard Deborah's voice at the door. Come in," he answered. "Why, father dearie," Deborah cried. "Oh, how well you're looking, Dad." And she kissed him happily. "Oh, but I'm glad to have you back." "That's good," he said, and he squeezed her hand. "Here, come to the light. Let me look at you." He saw her cheeks a little flushed, the gladness in her steady eyes. "Happy? Everything just right?" Her father nodded, smiling, and he gave a whimsical frown. "No ups and downs at all? That's bad." "Oh yes, plenty, but all so small. Good fellow to live with, very. And your work?" "It's going splendidly. I'll tell you about it this evening, after you give me the news from the farm." They chatted on for a short while, but he saw she was barely listening. "Can't you guess what it means?" she asked him softly. "To a woman of my age, after she has been so afraid she was too old, that she'd married too late, to know at last, to be sure at last, that she's to have a baby, Dad?" He drew back a little, and a lump rose in his throat. "By George!" he huskily exclaimed. "Oh, my dear, my dear." And he held her close in his arms for some time, till both of them grew sensible. Soon after she had gone to her room, he heard Allan coming upstairs. He heard her low sweet cry of welcome, a silence, then their voices. He heard them laughing together, and later Deborah humming a song. And still thinking of what she had told him, he felt himself so close to it all. And again the feeling came to him that surely he would live here for years. Allan came in, and they had a talk. "Deborah says she has told you the news." "Yes." "Everything's all right, I suppose, her condition, I mean," said Roger. "Couldn't be better. Just as I thought. Those 6 weeks we had up in Maine." "Yes, you both show it. Working hard?" "Yes." "And Deborah?" Roger asked. "You'll have to help me hold her in." They talked a few moments longer and went down to the living room. John was there with Deborah. All four went in to dinner. And through the conversation, from time to time, Roger noticed the looks that went back and forth between husband and wife. And again he caught Deborah smiling as though oblivious of them all. After dinner she went with him into his den. "Well, do you like the house?" she inquired. "Better than ever," he replied. "I wonder if you'll mind it. There'll be people coming to dinner, you know." "That won't bother me any," he said. "And committee meetings now and then. But you're safe in here. It's a good, thick door." "Let 'em talk," he retorted, "as hard as they please. You're married now. They can't scare me a bit. Only at 10 o'clock, by George, you've got to knock off and go to bed." "Oh, I'll take care of myself," she said. "If you don't, Allan will. We've had a talk." "Scheming already?" "Yes. When will it be?" "In April, I think." "You'll quit work in your schools?" "A month before." "And in the meantime, not too hard?" "No, and not too easy. I'm not sure now that I can do both." And Deborah kissed him gently. "I'm so happy, dearie, and oh, so very glad you're here." There followed for Roger after that many quiet evenings at home, untroubled days in his office. Seldom did he notice the progress of his ailment. His attention was upon his house, as this woman who mothered thousands of children worked on for her great family putting all in order, making ready for the crisis ahead when she would become the mother of one. Now, even more than ever, her work came crowding into his home. The house was old, but the house was new. For from schools and libraries, cafes and tenements and streets, the mighty formless hunger which had once so thrilled her father poured into the house itself, and soon became a part of it. He felt the presence of the school. He heard the daily gossip of that bewildering system of which his daughter was a part. A world in itself, with its politics, its many jarring factions, its jealousies, dissensions, its varied personalities, ambitions, and conspiracies. But in spite of these confusions, its more progressive elements, downing all distrusts and fears and drawing steadily closer to life, fearlessly rousing everywhere the hunger in people to live and learn and to take from this amazing world all the riches that it holds. The school with its great challenge steadily increasing its demands in the name of its children, demands which went deep down into conditions in the tenements and ramified through politics to the city hall, to Albany and even away to Washington. While day by day and week by week, from cities, towns, and villages came the vast prophetic story of the free public schools of the land. And meanwhile, in the tenements, still groping and testing, feeling her way, keeping close watch on her great brood, their wakening desires, their widening curiosities, Deborah was bringing them, children, mothers, and fathers too, together through the one big hope of brighter and more ample lives for everybody's children. Step by step this hope was spread out into the surrounding swamps and jungles of blind-driven lives, to find surprising treasures there deep buried under dirt and din, locked in the common heart of mankind. Old songs and fables, hopes and dreams and visions of immortal light, handed down from father to son, nurtured, guarded, breathed upon and clothed anew by countless generations, innumerable millions of simple men and women blindly struggling toward the sun. Over the door of one of the schools were these words carved in the stone: "Humanity is still a child. Our parents are all people who have lived upon the earth, our children all who are to come. And the dawn at last is breaking. The great day has just begun." This spirit of triumphal life poured deep into Roger's house. It was as though his daughter, in these last months which she had left for undivided service, were strengthening her faith in it all and pledging her devotion, as communing with herself she felt the crisis drawing near. Chapter 40. There came an interruption. One night when Deborah was out and Roger sat in his study alone, the maid came in highly flustered and said, "Mr. Gale, it's Miss Laura to see you." He turned with a startled jerk of his head, and his face slowly reddened. But when he saw the maid's eager expression, and saw that she was expecting a scene, with a frown of displeasure he rose from his chair. "Very well," he said, and he went to his daughter. He found her in the living room, no repentant Magdalene, but quite unabashed and at her ease. She came to her father quickly. "Oh, Dad, I'm so glad to see you, dear." And she gave him a swift, impetuous kiss, her rich lips for an instant pressing warmly to his cheek. "Laura," he said thickly, "come into my study, will you? I'm alone this evening." "I'm so glad you are," she replied. She followed him in, and he closed the door. He glanced at her confusedly. In her warmth, her elegance, an indefinable change in the tone and accent of her high magnetic voice, and in her ardent smiling eyes, she seemed to him more the foreigner now, and Roger's thoughts were in a whirl. What had happened? Had she married again? "Is Edith here still?" she was asking. "No, she's up in the mountains. She's living there," he answered. "Edith? In the mountains?" demanded Laura in surprise. And she asked innumerable questions. He replied to each one of them carefully, slowly, meanwhile getting control of himself. "And Deborah married at last. How has it worked? Is she happy, Dad?" "Very," he said. "And is she still keeping up her schools?" "Yes, for the present. She'll have to stop soon." Laura leaned forward, curious. "Tell me, Dad, a baby?" "Yes." She stared a moment. "Deborah," she softly explained. And in a moment, "I wonder." "What do you mean?" her father asked. But Laura evaded his question. She plied him with her inquiries for a few minutes longer, then turned to him with a challenging smile. "Well, father, don't you think you had better ask me now about myself?" He looked away a moment, then turned resolutely back. "I suppose so. When did you land?" "This morning, dear, from Italy, with my husband," she replied. And Roger started slightly. "I want you to meet him soon," she said. "Very well," he answered. At his disturbed, almost guilty expression, Laura laughed a little and rose and came over and hugged him tight. "Oh, but father dearest, it's working out so splendidly. I want you to know him and see for yourself. We've come to live in New York for a while. He has more to do here about war supplies." "More shrapnel, eh? Machine guns. More wholesale death," her father growled. But Laura smiled good-naturedly. "Yes, love from America. Aren't you all ashamed of yourselves, scrambling so to get rich quick out of this war you disapprove of?" "You look a bit rich," her father retorted. "Rather, for the moment," was her cheerful answer. "And you still like living in Italy?" "Tremendously. Rome is wonderful now." "Reborn, eh? Wings of the eagles." "Yes, and we're doing rather well." "I haven't noticed it," Roger said. "Why don't you send a few of your troops to help those plucky Frenchmen?" "Because," she replied, "we have a feeling that this is a war where we had much better help ourselves." "High ideals," he snorted. "Rome reborn," she remarked, unabashed. And her father scowled at her whimsically. "You're a heathen, I give you up," he declared. Laura had risen, smiling. "Oh, no, don't give me up," she said. "For you see," she added softly, "I'm a heathen with a great deal of love in her heart for thee, my dearest Dad. May I bring him down, my husband?" "Yes." "I'll telephone to Deborah to morrow and arrange it." When she had gone, he returned to his chair and sat for a long time in a daze. He was still disturbed and bewildered. What a daughter of his! And what did it mean? Could she really go on being happy like this? Sinning? Yes, she was sinning. Laura had broken her marriage vows. She had run off with another fella. Those were the plain, ugly facts. And now, divorced and remarried, she was careering gaily on. And her views of the war were plain heathenish. And yet there was something about her. Yes, he thought, he loved her still. What for? For being so happy. And yet she was wrong to be happy, all wrong. His thoughts went round in circles. And his confusion and dismay grew even deeper the next night when Laura brought her new husband to dine. For in place of the dark, polished scoundrel whom Roger had expected, here was a spruce and affable youth with thick light hair and ruddy cheeks, a brisk, pleasant manner of talking, and a decidedly forcible way of putting the case of his country at war. They kept the conversation to that. For despite Deborah's friendly air, she showed plainly that she wanted to keep the talk impersonal. And Laura, rather amused at this, replied by treating Deborah and Allan, and her father too, with a bantering forbearance for their old-fashioned, narrow views, and Deborah's religion of brotherhood democracy. All that to Laura was passé. From time to time Roger glanced at her face, into her clear and luminous eyes, so warm with the joy of living with this new man, her second. How his family had split apart. He wrote Edith the news of her sister, and he received but a brief reply. Nor did Deborah speak of it often. She seemed to want to forget Laura's life as the crisis in her own drew near. Chapter 51. Deborah had not yet stopped work. Again and again she put it off. For in her busy office, so many demands, both old and new, kept pressing in upon her. Such unexpected questions and vexing little problems kept cropping up as Deborah tried to arrange her work for the colleague who was to take her place in the spring, that day after day she lingered there, until one afternoon in March her husband went to her office, gave her an hour to finish up, and then brought her home with him. She had a fit of the blues that night. Allan was called out on a case, and a little while later Roger found his daughter alone in the living room, a book unopened in her lap, her gray eyes glistening with tears. She smiled when she caught sight of him. "It's so silly," she muttered unsteadily. "Just my condition, I suppose. I feel as though I had done with school for the remainder of my days. Better leave me now, dearie," she added. "I'm not very proud of myself to night, but I'll be all right in the morning." The next day she was herself again, and went quietly on with her preparations for the coming of her child. But still the ceaseless interests of those hordes of other children followed her into the house. Not only her successor, but principals and teachers came for counsel or assistance. And later, when reluctantly she refused to see such visitors, still the telephone kept ringing and letters poured in by every mail. For in her larger family there were weddings, births and deaths, and the endless savage struggle for life. And there were many climaxes of dreams and aspirations, of loves and bitter jealousies. And out of all this straining and this fever of humanity came messages to Deborah, last appeals for aid and advice, and gifts for the child who was to be born. Tiny garments quaintly made by women and girls from Italy, from Russia, and from Poland. Baby blankets, wraps and toys, and curious charms and amulets. There were so many of these gifts. "There's enough for 40 babies," Deborah told her father. "What on earth am I to do to avoid hurting anyone's feelings? And isn't it rather awful, the way these inequalities will crop up in spite of you? I know of 8 tenement babies born down there in this 1 week. How much fuss and feathers is made over them, and their coming into the world, poor mites." Roger smiled at his daughter. "You remind me of Jekyll and Hyde," he said. "Father, what a horrible thought. What have Jekyll and Hyde to do with me?" "Nothing, my dear," he answered. "Only it's queer and a little uncanny. Something I've never seen before, this double mother life of yours." It was only a few days later, when, coming home one evening, he found that Deborah's doctor had put her to bed and installed a nurse. There followed a week of keen suspense when Roger stayed home from the office. She liked to have him with her, and sitting at her bedside, he saw how changed his daughter was, how far in these few hours she had drawn into herself. He had suspected for some time that all was not well with Deborah, and Allan confirmed his suspicions. There was to be grave danger both for the mother and the child. It would come out all right, of course, he strove to reassure himself. Nothing else could happen now, with her life so splendidly settled at last. That fate could be so pitiless. No, it was unthinkable. "This is what comes of your modern woman," Roger exclaimed to Allan one night. "This is the price she's paying for those nerve-racking years of work." The crisis came toward the end of the week, and while for an entire night and through the day that followed and far into the next night the doctors and nurses fought for life in the room upstairs, Roger waited, left to himself, sitting in his study or restlessly moving through the house. And still that thought was with him, the price. It was kept in his mind by the anxious demands which her big family made for news. The telephone kept ringing. Women in motors from uptown and humbler visitors, young and old, kept coming to make inquiries. More gifts were brought and flowers, and Roger saw these people, and as he answered their questions he fairly scowled in their faces, unconsciously, for his mind was not clear. Reporters came. Barely an hour passed without bringing a man or woman from some one of the papers. He gave them only brief replies. Why couldn't they leave his house alone? He saw her name in headlines, Deborah Gale at point of death, and he turned angrily away. Vividly, on the second night, there came to him a picture of Deborah's birth so long ago in this same house. How safe it had been, how different, how secluded and shut in. No world had clamored then for news, and so vivid did this picture grow that when at last there came to his ears the shrill cry of a new life, it was some time before he could be sure whether this were not still his dream of that other night so long ago. But now a nurse had led him upstairs, and he stood by a cradle looking down at a small wrinkled face, almost wholly concealed by a soft woolly blanket. And presently Allan behind him said, "It's a boy, and he's to be named after you." Roger looked up. "How's the mother?" he asked. "Almost out of danger," was the reply. Then Roger glanced at Allan's face and saw how drawn and gray it was. He drew a long breath and turned back to the child. Allan had gone, and so had the nurse, and he was alone by the cradle. Relief and peace and happiness stole into his spirit. He felt the deep remoteness of this strange new little creature from all the clamoring world without, which he himself was soon to leave. The thought grew clearer, as with a curious steady smile Roger stood there looking down. "Well, little brother, you're here, thank God, and nobody knows how close we'll be for a little while," he thought, "for we're almost out of the world, you and I." Days passed. Deborah's strength increased, and soon they let Roger come into the room. She too was remote from the world for a time. That great family outside was anxious no longer. It left her alone. But soon it would demand her. Never again, he told himself, would she be so close, so intimate as here in her bed with this child of hers to whom she had given her father's name. "These hours are my real goodbyes." 2 long quiet weeks of this happiness, and then in a twinkling it was gone. The child fell sick. Within a few hours its small existence hung by a thread, and to Roger's startled eyes a new Deborah was revealed, tense and silent on her bed, her sensitive lips compressed with pain, her birthmark showing a jagged line of fiery red upon her brow, as her ears kept straining to catch every sound from the nursery adjoining. Through her hours of stern anguish she became the kind of mother that she had once so dreaded, shutting out everything else in the world, people, schools, all other children, rich or poor, well, sick or dying. Here was the crisis of Deborah's life. One night as she lay listening, with her hand gripping Roger's tight, frowning abruptly, she said to him in a harsh, unnatural voice, "They don't care any longer. None of them care. I'm safe, and they've stopped worrying, for they know they'll soon have me back at work. The work," she added fiercely, "that made my body what it is, not fit to bear a baby." She threw a quick and tortured look toward the door of the other room. "My work for those others all those years will be to blame if this one dies. And if it doesn't live, I'm through. I won't go on. I couldn't. I'd be too bitter after this toward all of them, those children." These last 2 words were whispers, so bitter they made Roger cold. "But this child is going to live," he responded hoarsely. Its mother stared up with a quivering frown. The next moment her limbs contracted as from an electric shock. There had come a faint wail from the other room, and this went on for 3 days and nights. Again Roger lived as in a dream. He saw haggard faces from time to time of doctors, nurses, servants. He saw Allan now and then, his tall, ungainly figure stooped, his features gaunt, his strong, wide jaw set like a vice, but his eyes kind and steady still, his low voice reassuring. And Roger noticed John at times hobbling quickly down a hall and stopping on his crutches before a closed door, listening. Then these figures would recede, and it was as though he were alone in the dark. At last the nightmare ended. One afternoon as he sat in his study, Allan came in slowly and dropped exhausted into a chair. He turned to Roger with a smile. "Safe now, I think," he said quietly. Roger went to Deborah and found her asleep, her face at peace. He went to his room and fell himself into a long, dreamless slumber. In the days which followed, again he sat at her bedside, and together they watched the child in her arms. So feeble still the small creature appeared that they both spoke in whispers. But as little by little its strength returned, Deborah too became herself. And though still jealously watchful of its every movement, she had time for other thinking. She had talks with her husband, not only about their baby, but about his work and hers. Slowly her old interest in all they had had in common returned, and to the messages from outside she gave again a kindlier ear. "Allan tells me," she said one day when she was alone with her father, "that I can have no more children. And I'm glad of that. But at least I have one," she added, "and he has already made me feel like a different woman than before. I feel sometimes as though I'd come 1,000,000 miles along in life. And yet again it feels so close, all that I left back there in school. Because I'm so much closer now to every mother and every child. At last I'm one of the family." Chapter 42. Of that great family, one member had been in the house all through the month which had just gone by. But he had been so quiet, so carefully unobtrusive, that he had been scarcely noticed. Very early each morning, day after day, John had gone outside for his breakfast, and thence to the office, where he himself had handled the business as well as he could, only coming to Roger at night now and then with some matter he could not settle alone, but always stoutly declaring that he needed no other assistance. "Don't come, Mr. Gale," he had urged. "You look worn out. You'll be sick yourself if you ain't careful. And anyhow, if you hang around, you'll be here whenever she wants you." Early in Deborah's illness, John had offered to give up his room for the use of one of the nurses. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Johnny," Allan had responded. "But we've got plenty of room as it is. Just you stick around. We want you here." "All right, Doc. If there's any little thing, you know, answering the phone at night or anything else I can do." "Thank you, so. I'll let you know. But in the meantime, go to bed." From that day on, John had taken not only his breakfast but his supper too outside, and no one had noticed his absence. Coming in late, he had hobbled silently up to his room, stopping to listen at Deborah's door. He had kept so completely out of the way, it was not till the baby was 3 weeks old and past its second crisis that Deborah thought to ask for John. When he came to her bed, she smiled up at him with the baby in her arms. "I thought we'd see him together," she said. John stood on his crutches, staring down, and as Deborah watched him, all at once her look grew intent. "Johnny," she said softly, "go over there, will you, and turn up the light so we can see him better." And when this was done, though she still talked smilingly of the child, again and again she glanced up at John's face, at the strange self-absorbed expression, stern and sad and wistful there. When he had gone, the tears came in her eyes, and Deborah sent for her husband. The next day at the office, John came into Roger's room. Roger had been at work several days, and they had already cleared up their affairs. "Here's something," said John gruffly, "that I wish you'd put away somewhere." And he handed to his partner a small blue leather album filled with the newspaper clippings dealing with Deborah's illness. On the front page was one with her picture and a long record of her service to the children of New York. "She wouldn't want to see it now," John continued awkwardly, "but I thought maybe later on the boy would like to have it." "What do you think?" he inquired. Roger gave him a kindly glance. "I think he will. It's a fine thing to keep." And he handed it back. "But I guess you'd better put it away and give it to her later yourself." John shifted his weight on his crutches so quickly that Roger looked up in alarm. "Look here, you're not well." He saw now that the face of the cripple was white, and the sweat was glistening on his brow. John gave a harsh little nervous laugh. "Oh, it's nothing much, partner," he replied. "That's another thing I wanted to tell you. I've had some queer pains lately, new ones." He caught his breath. "Why didn't you tell me, you young fool?" "You had your own troubles, didn't you?" John spoke with difficulty. "But I'll be all right, I guess. All I need is a few days off." Roger had pressed a button, and his stenographer came in. "Call a taxi," he said sharply, "and John, you go right over there and lie down. I'm going to take you home at once." "I've got a better scheme," said John, setting his determined jaws. The sweat was pouring down his cheeks. "It may be a week, but there's just a chance it may be a little worse than that. So I've got a room in a hospital, see? Be better all around." He swayed forward. "Johnny!" Roger caught him just in time, and the boy lay senseless in his arms. At home, a few hours later, Allan came with another physician down from John's small bedroom. He saw his colleague to the door and then came in to Roger. "I'm afraid Johnny has come to the end." For a moment Roger stared at him. "Has, eh?" he answered huskily. "You're absolutely sure he has? There's nothing on earth we can do?" "Nothing more than we're doing now. He has fooled you fellows before, you know. Not this time." "How long will it be? Days or hours?" "I don't know." "He mustn't suffer. I'll see to that." Roger rose and walked the floor. "It was the last month did it, of course." "Yes." "I blame myself for that." "I wouldn't," said Allan gently. "You've done a good deal for Johnny Geer." "He has done a good deal for this family." "Can Deborah see him?" "I wish she could." "Better stretch a point for her, hadn't you?" "She's been a kind of mother to John." "I know, but she can't leave her bed." "Then you won't tell her?" "I think she knows. She talked to me about him last night." "That's it, a mother," Roger cried. "She was watching. We were blind." He came back to his chair and dropped into it. "Does John know this himself?" he asked. "He suspects it, I think," said Allan. "Then go and tell him, will you? That he's going to get well. And after you've done it, I'll see him myself. I've got something in mind I want to think out." After Allan had left the room, Roger sat thinking about John. He thought of John's birth and his drunken mother, the accident and his struggle for life, through boyhood and childhood, through ignorance and filth and pain, through din and clamor and hunger, fear, of the long fierce fight which John had made not to be put away in some big institution, of his battle to keep up his head, to be somebody, make a career for himself. He thought of John's becoming one of Deborah's big family, only one of thousands, but it seemed now to Roger that John had stood out from them all, as the figure best embodying that great fierce hunger for a full life, and as the link connecting the one who slowly, year by year, had emerged from his greater family and come into her small one. And last of all he thought of John as his own companion, his only one, in the immense adventure on which he was soon to embark. A few moments later he stood by John's bed. "Pretty hard, Johnny?" he gently asked. "Oh, not so bad as it might be, I guess. You'll soon feel better, they tell me, boy." John shut his eyes. "Yes," he muttered. "Can you stand my talking just a minute?" "Sure I can," John whispered. "I'm not suffering any now. He's given me something to put me to sleep." "What is it you want to talk about? Business?" "Not exactly, partner. It's about the family. You've got so you're almost one of us. I guess you know us pretty well." "I guess I do. It's meant a lot to me, Mr. Gale." "But I'll tell you what you don't know, John," Roger went on slowly. "I had a son in the family once, and he died when he was 3 months old. That was a long time ago, and I never had another, you see, to take his place, till you came along." There fell a breathless silence. "And I've been thinking lately," Roger added steadily. "I haven't long to live, you know, and I've been wondering whether you'd like to come into the family. Take my name. Do you understand?" John said nothing. His eyes were still closed. But presently, groping over the bed, he found Roger's hand and clutched it tight. After this, from time to time, his throat contracted sharply. Tears welled from under his eyelids. Then gradually, as the merciful drug which Allan had given him took its work, his clutch relaxed and he began breathing deep and hard. But still for some time longer Roger sat quietly by his side. The next night he was there again. Death had come to the huddled form on the bed, but there had been no relaxing. With the head thrown rigidly far back, and all the features tense and hard, it was a fighting figure still, a figure of stern protest against the world's injustice. But Roger was not thinking of this, but of the discovery he had made that in their talk of the night before, John had understood him completely. For upon a piece of paper which Allan had given the lad that day, these words had been painfully inscribed: "This is my last will and testament. I am in my right mind. I know what I am doing, though nobody else does. Nobody is here. To my partner, Roger Gale, I'll leave my share in our business. And to my teacher, Deborah Baird, I'll leave my crutches for her school." End of section 13. Recording by JCarson. Section 14 of His Family. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JCarson. His Family by Ernest POOLE. Chapter 43. After John had gone away, the house was very quiet. Only from the room upstairs there could be heard occasionally the faint clear cry of Deborah's child. And once again to Roger came a season of repose. He was far from unhappy. His disease, although progressing fast, gave him barely any pain. It rather made its presence felt by the manner in which it affected his mind. His inner life grew uneven. At times his thoughts were as in a fog. Again they were amazingly clear, and vistas opened far ahead. He could not control his thinking. This bothered him at the office, in the work he still had to do. For some months he had been considering an offer from one of his rivals, a modern concern which wished to buy out his business together with that of 3 other firms and consolidate them all into one corporation. And Roger was selling, and it was hard. For the whole idea of bargaining was more distasteful than ever now. He had to keep reminding himself of Edith and her children. At last it was over, his books were closed, and there was nothing left to be done. Nor did he care to linger. These rooms had meant but little to him. They had been but a place of transition from the old office far downtown, so full of memories of his youth, to the big corporation looming ahead, the huge impersonal clipping mill into which his business was to merge. and it came to mind that New York was like that. No settled calm abiding place cherishing its memories, but only a town of transition, a great turbulent city of change, restlessly shaking off its past, tearing down and building anew, building higher, 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 rearing to the very stars and shouting, "Can you see me now?" What was the goal of this mad career? What dazzling city would be here? For a time he stared out of his window as into a promised land. Slowly at last he rose from his desk. Clippings, clippings, clippings. He looked at those long rows of girls, gleaning in items large and small the public reputations of all kinds of men and women, new kinds in a new nation, seething with activities, sweeping on like some wide river, swollen at flood season, to a new America, a world which Roger would not know. And yet it would be his world still, for in it he would play a part. In their lives, too, we shall be there, the dim, strong figures of the past. From his desk he gathered a few belongings. Then he looked into John's small room with the big gold motto over the desk, "This is no place for your troubles or mine." On the desk lay that small album, John's parting gift to Deborah's boy. Roger picked it up and walked out of the office. He had never liked goodbyes. In the elevator he noticed that his shoes needed shining, and when he reached the street below, he stopped at the stand on the corner. The stocky Greek with bushy black hair, who had run the stand for many years, gave him a cheery greeting. For Roger had stopped there frequently. Not that he cared about his shoes, but he had always liked to watch the crowds of people passing. "No hurry, boss?" "None," said Roger. "Then I give a fine shine. Polish too?" "Yes, polish too." And Roger settled back to watch. "And put in new shoestrings," he added, with a whimsical smile. Men and women, girls and boys by thousands passed him, pushing, hurrying, shuffling by. Girls tittering and nudging and darting quick side glances, bobbing heads and figures, vigorous steps and dancing eyes. Life bubbling over everywhere in laughter, in sharp, angry tones, in glad, expectant chatter. Deborah's big family. Across the street was a movie between two lurid posters, and there was a dance hall overhead. The windows were all open, and faintly above the roar of the street he could hear the piano, drum, fiddle and horn. The thoroughfare each moment grew more tumultuous to his ears, with trolley cars and taxis, motor buses, trucks and drays. A small red motor dashed uptown with piles of evening papers. A great black motor hearse rushed by. In a taxi which had stopped in a jam, a man was kissing a girl in his arms, and both of them were laughing. The smart little toque of blue satin she wore was crushed to one side. How red were her lips as she threw back her head. "Silk or cotton, boss? Which you like?" Roger glanced at the shoestrings and pondered. "Silk," he grunted in reply. Idly for a moment he watched this busy little man. From whence had he come in far-away Greece? What existence had he here, and what kind of life would he still have through those many years to come? A feeling half of sadness crept into Roger's heavy eyes as he looked at the man, at his smiling face, and then at other faces in the multitudes sweeping past. The moment he tried to single them out, how doubly chaotic it became. What an ocean of warm desires, passions, vivid hopes and worries. Vaguely he could feel them pass. Often in the midst of his life, his active and self-centered life, Roger had looked at these crowds on the street and had thought these faces commonplace. But now at the end it was not so. A woman with a baby carriage stopped directly in front of him and stood there anxiously watching for a chance to cross the street. And Roger thought of Deborah. Heavily he climbed down from his seat, paid the man, and bade him good night, and went home to see Deborah's baby. For a long time he sat by the cradle. Presently Deborah joined him, and soon they were laughing heartily at the astonishing jerks and kicks and grimaces of the tiny boy. He was having his bath, and he hated it. But safe at last on his mother's lap, wrapped to his ears in a big soft towel, he grew very gay and contented, and looked waggishly about. There followed long lazy days of spring, as April drifted into May. Early in the morning Roger could hear through his window the cries of the vendors of flowers and fruits, and he listened drowsily. He rose late and spent most of the day in the house, but occasionally he went out for a stroll. And one balmy evening, when groups of youths came trooping by, singing in close harmony, Roger called a taxi and went far down through the tenement streets to a favorite haunt of his, a little Syrian pawn shop, where after long delving he purchased a ring to put in the new collection that he had been making lately. He had nearly a dozen now. Days passed. The house was still so quiet. Deborah was still upstairs. At last, one night, upon leaving his study, he stopped uncertainly in the hall. He took more time than was his wont in closing up the house for the night, in trying all the windows, in turning out the various lights. Room after room he left in the dark. Then he went slowly up the stairs, his hand gratefully feeling those guiding points grown so familiar to his touch through many thousand evenings. His hand lingered on the banister, and he stopped again to listen there. He did not come downstairs again. He was able to sleep but little at night. Turning restlessly on his bed, he would glance out of the window up at the beetling wall close by, tier on tier of apartments from which faint voices dropped out of the dark. Gradually, as the night wore on, these voices would all die away into long, mysterious silences, for to him at least such silences had grown to be very mysterious. Alone the hours that followed, even these modern neighbors and this strange new eager town pressing down upon his house, seemed no longer strange to him, nor so appallingly immense, seemed even familiar and small to him, as the eyes of his mind looked out ahead. From his bed he could see on the opposite wall the picture Judith had given him, always so fresh and cool and dim, with its deep restful tones of blue, of the herdsman and the cattle on the dark mountain rim at dawn. And vaguely he wondered whether it was because he saw more clearly, or whether his mind in this curious haze could no longer see so well, that as he looked before him he felt no fear nor any more uncertainty. All his doubts had lifted. He was so sure of Judith now. As though she were coming to meet him, her image grew more vivid, with memories emerging out of all the years gone by. What memories, what vivid scenes, what intimate conversations they had, her voice so natural, close to his ear as together they planned for their children. Wistfully he would search the years for what he should soon tell his wife, until the drowsiness returned, and then again came visions. But by day it was not so, for the life of the house would rouse him, and at intervals hold his attention. One evening a slight rustle, a faint fragrance in the room, made Roger suddenly open his eyes, and he saw Laura by his bed, her slender figure clad in blue silk, something white at her full bosom. He noticed her shapely shoulders, her glossy hair, and moist red lips. She was smiling down at him. "See what I've brought you, dear," she said, and she turned to a chair where, one on the other, tray after tray, was piled his whole collection of rings. At sight of them his eyes grew fixed. He could feel his pulse beat faster. "How did you ever find them?" he asked his daughter huskily. "Oh, I had a long hunt all by myself. But I found them at last, and I've brought them home. Shall we look them over a little while?" "Yes," he said. She turned up the light and came and sat down at the bedside with a tray of rings in her lap. One by one she held them up to his gaze, still smiling and talking softly on in that rich melodious voice of hers, of which he heard but snatches. How good it felt to be so gay! No solemn thoughts, no questionings, just these dusky glittering beauties here, deep soft gleams of color, each with its suggestion of memories for Roger, a procession of adventures reaching back into his life. He smiled and lay in silence watching, until at last she bent over him, kissed him softly, breathed a good night, and went out of the room. Roger followed her with his glance. He knew he would never see her again. How graceful of her to go like that. He lay there thinking about her. In her large blue limousine he saw his gay young daughter speeding up the avenue, the purple gleaming pavement reflecting studded lines of lights, and he thought he could see her smiling still. He recalled scattered fragments of her life, the first luxurious little menage, and the second. How many more would there be? She was only in her 20s still. Uneasily he tried to see into the years ahead for her, and he thought he saw a lonely old age, childless, loveless, cynical, hard. But this fear soon fell from his mind. No, whatever happened, she would do it gracefully, an artist always, to the end. He sighed and gave up the effort, for he could not think of Laura as old, nor could he think of her any more as being a part of his family. Edith came to him several times, and there was something in her face which gave him sharp forebodings. Making a great effort, he tried to talk to her clearly. "It's hard to keep up with your children," he said. "It means keeping up with everything new. And you stay in your rut, and then it's too late. Before you know it, you are old." But his words subsided in mutterings, and Roger wearily closed his eyes, for a glance up into Edith's face had shown him only pity there, and no heed to his warning. He saw that she looked upon him as old, and still upon herself as young, though he noticed the threads of gray in her hair. Then he realized she had gone, and that his chamber had grown dark. He must have been dreaming. Of what, he asked. He tried to remember, and suddenly out of the darkness, so harsh and clear it startled him, a picture rose in Roger's mind of a stark lonely figure, a woman in a graveyard, cutting the grass on the family graves. Where had he seen it? He could not recall. What had it to do with Edith? Was she not living in New York? What had so startled him just now? Some thought, some vivid picture, some nightmare he could not recall. His last talks were with Deborah, all through those days and the long nights, too. He kept fancying she was in the room, and it brought deep balm to his restless soul. He asked her to tell him about the schools, and Deborah talked to him quietly. She was going back to her work in the fall. She felt very humble about it. She told him she felt older now, and she saw that her work was barely begun. But she was even happier than before. Her hand lay in his, and it tightened there. He opened his eyes and looked up into hers. "All so strange," he muttered. "Life." There was a sharp contracting of her wide and sensitive mouth. "Yes, dear, strange," she whispered. "But I'm so glad you're going on." He frowned as he tried to be simple and clear, and make her feel he understood what she had set herself to do. All people, he said slowly, never counted so much as now, and never so hungry, all, as now, for all of life, like children, children who should go to school. Your work will grow, I can see ahead. Never a time when every man and woman and child could grow so much, and hand it on, as you will do to your small son." He felt her hand on his forehead, and for some moments nothing was said. Vaguely in glimpses Roger saw his small grandson growing up, and he pictured other children here, not her own, but of her greater family, as the two merged into one. He felt that she should not grow old. Children, lives of children, work, dreams and aspirations. How bright it seemed as he stared ahead. Then he heard the cry of her baby. "Shall I nurse him here?" he heard her ask. He pressed her hand in an answer, and when again he opened his eyes, she was by his side with the child at her breast. Its large round eyes, so pure and clear, gazed into his own for a long, long time. "Now he's so sleepy," she whispered. "Would you like him beside you a moment, please?" He felt the faint scent of the tiny boy, and still those eyes looked into his. He forgot his daughter standing there, and as he watched, a sweet fresh sense of the mystery of this life, so new, stole deep into his spirit. All at once the baby fell asleep. "Good night, little brother," he whispered. "God grant the world be very kind." He could feel the mother lift it up, and he heard the door close softly. Smiling, he too fell asleep. And after that there were only dreams. Chapter 44. And his dreams were of children. Their faces passed before him. Now they were young again in the house. They were eating their suppers, 3 small girls, chattering like magpies. From her end of the table their mother smiled quietly across at him. "Come, children," she was saying, "that will do for a little while." But Roger said, "Oh, let them talk." Then he saw newcomers. Bruce came in with Edith, and George and young Elizabeth, and Allan came with Deborah, who had a baby in her arms, and Laura stood beside them. Here were his 3 daughters, grown, but still in some uncanny way they looked to him like children still. And behind them he detected figures long forgotten, of boys and girls whom he had known far back in his own childhood. John, too, had come into the house. Strangely now, the walls were gone, had lifted, and a clamorous throng, laughing, shouting, pummeling, hedged him in on every hand. Deborah's big family. Soon the roar wearied him, and Roger tried to shut them out, to bring back again the walls to his house. And sometimes he succeeded, and he was left for a while in peace with Judith and his 3 small girls. But despite his efforts to keep them there, new faces kept intruding. Swiftly his small family grew, split into other families, and these were merged with other figures, pressing in from every side. Again he felt the presence of countless families all around, dividing, reuniting with ceaseless changes and fresh life, a never-ending multitude. Here they were singing and dancing, and Laura gaily waved to him. At another place were only men, and they were struggling savagely to clutch things from each other's hands. A sea of scowling visages, angry shouts, fists clenched in air. And he thought he saw Bruce for an instant. Behind them lay wide valleys, obscured by heavy clouds of smoke, and then he could hear the roar of guns. But they vanished suddenly, and he saw women mourning now, and Edith with her children turned to him her anxious eyes. He tried to reach and help her, but already she was gone. And behind her came huge bending forms, men heaving at great burdens, jaws set in scowls of fierce revolt. And John was there on his crutches, and near him was a figure bound into a chair of steel, with terror in the straining limbs, while in desperation Deborah tried to wrench him free. Abruptly Roger turned away. And in a twinkling all was gone, the tumult and the clamor, and he was in a silent place, high up on a mountain side. It was dusk. A herd of cattle passed, and George came close behind them. And around him Roger saw, emerging from the semi-dark, faces turning like his own to the summits of the mountains and the billowy splendors there. It grew so dark he could see no more. There fell a deep silence, not a sound, but the occasional chirp of a bird or the faint whir of an insect. Even the glow on the peaks was gone. Darkness, only darkness. Surely this is death, he thought. After that he was alone, and presently from far away he heard the booming of a bell, deep and slow, sepulchral, as it measured off his life. Another silence followed, and this time it was more profound. And with a breathless awe he knew that all the people who had ever lived on earth were before him in the void to which he himself was drifting. People of all nations, of countless generations, reaching back and back and back to the beginnings of mankind. The mightiest family of all, that had stumbled up through the ages, had slaved and starved and dreamed and died, had blindly hated, blindly killed, had raised up gods and idols and yearned for everlasting life, had laughed and played and danced along, had loved and mated, given birth, had endlessly renewed itself and handed on its heritage, had striven hungrily to learn, had groped its way in darkness, and after all its struggles had come now barely to the dawn. And then a voice within him cried, "What is humanity but a child? In the name of the dead I salute the unborn." Slowly a glow appeared in his dream, and once again the scene had changed. The light was coming from long rows of houses rising tall and steep out of the teeming city street. And from these lighted houses children now came pouring forth. They filled the street from wall to wall with a torrent of warm, vivid hues. They joined in mad, tempestuous games. They shouted and they danced with glee. They whirled each other round and round. The very air seemed quivering. Then was heard the crash of a band, and he saw them marching into school. In and in and in they pressed, till the school seemed fairly bursting. Out they came by another way, and went off marching down the street with a big flag waving at their head. He followed and saw the street divide into narrower streets and byways, into roads and country lanes, and all were filled with children. In endless multitudes they came, marching, marching, spreading, spreading, like wide bobbing fields of flowers rolling out across the land, toward a great round flashing sun above a distant rim of hills. The sun rose, strangely dazzling. It filled the heavens with blinding light. He felt himself drawn up and up, while from somewhere far behind he heard the cry of Deborah's child. A clear, sweet thrill of happiness came, and after that we do not know, for he had left his family. End of section 14. Recording by James Carson. End of His Family by Ernest POOLE.